I've come to tell you what I see. There are great darknesses.
You kill me, bitch! That's the joke of all time.
Keep away from the windows. Somebody might blow you a kiss.
Silencio. Silencio.
Don't you like the taste of blood?
You have meddled with the primal forces of nature, Mr. Beale.
I shall now count from 1 to 10.
We're gonna get done, dude!
Yes! He hates these cans! Because he's here!
Welcome to the Church of Cinematic Oblivion. I'm Nick.
And I'm Harry, and today we are continuing our 3-part history of slasher films.
That's right. This is Slashers Part 2, The Turning Point. In our last episode, we covered some odd 3,000 years, and maybe we glazed over some of those early millennia, but we very much did focus on the early 20th century in horror film. And this episode, we're only going to be focusing on 4 years.
Yeah, we're picking up right where we left off. In the last episode, we ended with Torso in 1973, and we are picking up with 1974.
That's right. 1974 was a very important year for horror. A lot of things happened, and we're going to follow that trend all the way through to 1978 and see how things finally cemented. But before we get into all that, I just want to go back and discuss a few of the things we got wrong or forgot to mention in episode 1. We really appreciate all the feedback we've gotten, a lot of encouragement, and some people who took the time to tell us what we'd gotten wrong. And we appreciate that. It's great to crowdsource out, fact-checking to the masses.
Well, something I forgot to mention that I think is really important is the idea of urban legends. And that a big thing that we'll see, especially in part 3, is that the urban legend is a huge part of the slasher film. Slashers came out in the 70s, where, we were kind of nostalgic for 1950s Americana. And with that Americana comes the idea of myths and urban legends. And that becomes a big part of movies that we see later, like Halloween and Friday the 13th.
Great point. And also some of the first films we'll be talking about tonight are based on urban legends. Also, I think urban legends are the modern version of old folk tales. Urban legends are like contemporary folk tales. We didn't really go into all of the grisly folk tales. We focused on theater. We focused on tragedy and Jacobean revenge and stuff like that. Now, of course, I think anyone who's done any research into the origins of Disney films knows that the stories that inspire kids' movies are often way more grisly than the versions we eventually see. But of all of the grisly folktales and fairy tales that I heard as a kid, I think one that sticks with me as a proto-slasher is Bluebeard. We never got to talk about it in the last episode. Essentially, Bluebeard is about a woman who marries a weird man with a blue beard, which is significant because it kind of indicates that he's from another world. He tells her she can go in any door in the house except for one door, one room. One time when he's out of town, she goes in, and all of his wives who he murdered are in there.
Right, their heads are hanging on the wall.
Well, their bodies, too. Or
I think it's just their heads.
Different versions.
Anyway, the point is, it's not only a slasher murderer, it's also a lot of themes of female captivity and male aggression that we'll see in a lot of the movies we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, we're going to get into all that, anima stuff tonight. We didn't really get to talk about the mystery angle. We talked about old dark house films, but if you want to learn more about the origins of mysteries, the very first procedural murder mystery was a novel named Madame de Scudéry about an old woman who solved murders, and that later inspired Edgar Allan Poe to create 3 stories: Murders in the Rue Morgue, The Mystery of Maria Roget, and The Purloined Letter, which then inspired Arthur Conan Doyle to write Sherlock Holmes. Also, I only breezed past The Cat and the Canary, which is a Bob Hope third rendition of a play that was a very important old dark house film. It's not that essential to slasher history, but The Cat and the Canary is worth a watch if you're interested in old dark house history.
Yeah, and then I guess my mistake was that I kept saying giallos instead of gialli. But,
yes, thanks to Threadshitter.
But I think it's fine if we get a little bit of grammatic. We're not great with our Italian grammar.
Listen, it is totally true that the plural of giallo is gialli, and we said giallos, but we're Americanizing it, which is exactly what slasher movies did to giallos.
Hey, it's giallos. What do you want?
It's a giallo. What do you want from me? But thank you, Threadshitter, for the feedback. And thank you to the whole Reddit community who got back to us. I do think it's important to note that a little bit after And Then There Were None was written, a little bit after, 4 years after the Renee Clare film came out, the game Clue, or Cluedo, came out. And the game Clue, if you've ever played it, Colonel Mustard in the parlor with the pipe, that game is clearly based on And Then There Were None,
Right.
in plot and in format.
When you play Clue, you have to figure out who did it. There are suspects, weapons, and scenes for a crime.
Mr. Green did it in the study with a knife. I got a clue card. I know. It was Miss Scarlet in the conservatory with a candlestick. Wow! Elementary, my dear Betsy.
Clue from Parker Brothers.
Lastly, just the last couple of corrections. I kept calling Sergio Martino's film.
Martino.
I kept calling his film Your Vice is a Locked Door and Only I Have the Key. It's Your Vice is a Locked Room and Only I Have the Key.
Which is playing at the Roxy Theater next month. And you should go see it.
Yeah, if you're in San Francisco, check it out at the Roxy Theater. And then lastly, we talked a lot about Theater of Blood in terms of the way that theater used to be, plays used to be. Vincent Price was in a film in the early 70s or late 60s, I'm not exactly sure, called Theater of Blood, in which he killed according to Shakespeare plays. I feel like that's
pretty cool.
Yeah, it's actually pretty good, and it's a significant step in the slasher direction. He also did Dr. Phibes, in which he killed according to the plagues of Egypt.
Right, and Dr. Phibes is more notable for being proto-Saw than
Right.
proto-slasher.
But moving on, let's get into the 4 chapters here. This is part 2 of Slashers, The Turning Point, 1974 to 1978. It is well known that monsters made up the majority of well-known early 20th century American horror films, and then in the 60s and 70s, Satan and devil and possession movies kind of went into vogue for a sec. But the 70s also foreshadowed what the dominant American horror trend of the 80s would be, which was human beings, shrouded in mystery, driven by twisted psyches, who are embodiments of what it means to be human. And I guess we first see those in 1974.
Right, so we'll pick up with Chapter 1, Head Cheese.
The film which you are about to see is an account of the tragedy which befell a group of 5 youths, in particular, Sally Hardesty and her invalid brother, Franklin. It is all the more tragic in that they were young. But had they lived very, very long lives, they could not have expected, nor would they have wished to see as much of the mad and macabre as they were to see that day. For them, an idyllic summer afternoon drive became a nightmare. The events of that day were to lead to the discovery of one of the most bizarre crimes in the annals of American history, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
Sally, I hear something. Stop! Stop!
That's crazy! You gotta make us stop! Please!
Nothing. He's just a cook. Shut up, you bitch hog.
Before we unpack all of the influences the Texas Chainsaw Massacre had on the rest of cinema, we need to go back 2 years to a very, very successful film called Deliverance, based on a very successful novel of 2 years earlier by James Dickey. Deliverance from 1972, you would most know because of the squeal like a pig scene, infamous hillbilly rape scene. The basic plot is 4 friends from the city go rafting, and they are assaulted by some locals in the forest. They defend themselves and murder the locals and decide to keep it a secret among themselves.
And the basic idea is this idea of that out in the country where there's no one to watch you, we all kind of become savages and we experience savagery. And that led to this whole genre in the 70s and 80s of hicksploitation, as it was called, which are exploitation movies that exploited, wild redneck hillbilly antics.
This is a fear that still exists. People who are the major movie-going audience of urban areas often have very little experience of rural America or of middle America, and so these films prey on our fears.
Well, they were
those
making
areas.
movies in this vein up through the 2000s with like the Wrong Turn films. And
Right?
stuff.
Yeah, they still make them. With that French film Frontiers is about the same kind of fear in French society.
Yeah.
And Calvaire. Same thing.
Hillbillies are eternally scary.
I'm sure to a lot of people in Middle America, these kind of films are very offensive, but they became very popular, and in 1974, the most important version of them, shall we say, occurred. And while Deliverance is like mostly a survival drama,
it's really not a horror movie.
No, it has that one rape scene is incredibly disturbing, and it's become a touchstone of culture as a result. But it's really the only scene of intense person-to-person violence. There's a few later on, but it's mostly a survival film. Texas Chainsaw Massacre by Tobe Hooper, made in 1974, decided to dig deep into true crime history and really lean into the grisly aspect of hicksploitation.
Yeah. So while this movie is also much like Psycho based on the life of Ed Gein, whereas Psycho focused on his mother complex, Texas Chainsaw Massacre focuses on the gruesome, visceral gore of it.
Yeah, in Psycho, so once again, we mentioned him in the last episode. Ed Gein, famous grave robber, murdered 2 women. His mother died, and he started to make things out of skin and bone of local dead bodies that he dug up from the graveyard, and also 2 women he killed. He would make cups and bowls and clothes. He wore women's skin. He would wear people's faces on over his face. They reduced all of that in Psycho to just that he has a taxidermy habit.
Well, they did the taxidermy habit, and they really just focused on the mother complex. Whereas Texas Chainsaw basically takes like a written description of the crime scene and recreates that in the sets of the family.
The remains of a badly decomposed body wired to a large monument. A second body was found in a ditch near the perimeter of the cemetery. Subsequent investigation has revealed at least a dozen empty crypts, and it's feared more will turn up as the probe continues.
So in 1973, the year after Deliverance, there is a movie we have not been able to get our hands on.
Right.
We've only seen the trailer. It's kind of a popular trailer in horror circles. It was called 3 on a Meat Hook. It seems to be very similar to what later would be Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
The only ones left to mourn. The last witnesses to the execution. Suspended in time by a puppeteer with blood on his hands. Little broken dolls that go on dancing after the music has stopped. 3 on a meat hook.
Well, it's just the idea of Ed Gein was so grotesque and horrifying to a lot of people, even though he didn't really kill that many people. It was more just the details that it inspired a lot of fiction that would follow in that vein.
Yes, exactly. There was also a novel in 1973 by the wonderful author who you would know more so for writing The Road and No Country for Old Men and Blood Meridian, Cormac McCarthy. That novel was called Child of God.
Which was later made into a movie directed by James Franco.
Was it?
Yeah.
There was a movie of this?
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, this is a fantastic book. I highly recommend it if you're at all into these kind of grisly stories. And if you're at all into the story of Ed Gein, it's a fantastic retelling. Just to be clear, detail-wise, Ed Gein lived in Wisconsin, not Texas.
Yeah, but they were both very rural.
Leatherface lives in Texas. Who knows where 3 on a Meat Hook took place? Psycho is like California, right?
Psycho is Arizona.
Arizona.
Well, Bates might be in California because she's driving.
And Child of God by McCarthy is Tennessee. There's a couple great lines in this book. I'll maybe come back to it. There's one line in particular that really unsettled me. In the scene where Cormac McCarthy, who's known for his dark and clipped and succinct writing style, when he writes about Lester Ballard, who's his Ed Gein character, when he writes about Lester Ballard looking at the first dead body he ever brought home, he writes, "He took off all her clothes and looked at her, inspecting her body carefully, as if he would see how she were made." And this is an interesting way of thinking about Ed Gein, because he's someone who was all obsessed with taking bodies apart and building things out of them. Mm. And that's what we really get into.
The real old school craftsman.
In Texas Chainsaw, it's more like an old episode of
no one works with their hands anymore these days. It's all on computers. But Ed Gein.
This is like A&E's Hoarders, but like to the utmost.
Yeah.
So, Texas Chainsaw Massacre comes out in 1974. I would say I can't think of many things that came before it that are like it.
It upended every classical notion of how to build suspense in a horror movie. It's like, I consider it, along with Killing of a Chinese Bookie, to be one of the nails in Hitchcock's coffin. It is so anti-suspense and just in-your-face brutality that instead of feeling like you're in a movie that's very tense and suspenseful, you feel like you're living in a situation that is filled with horror and grotesquerie.
Yeah, and as you said before, it takes place in the light of day, literally. Now, sure, there are sequences at night, but...
No, and whereas that's what the one thing that really separates it from slasher movies is slashers are all about killers lurking in shadows and hiding in the dark, and Texas Chainsaw is about killers being right in your face and tormenting you in front of your open eyes.
So we're not considering Texas Chainsaw Massacre to be the first slasher movie.
No, it's not a slasher. It has some slasher tropes, and it's very significant with the development of slashers, but it is not itself a true slasher.
This is what's actually hard for me, is Texas Chainsaw Massacre has all of the elements in place of a slasher movie. It has a mystery killer. Not that you really ever find out who the killer is. It has the one-by-one killings. It has an old dark house.
It doesn't really have one-by-one killings, though, because the two main killings happen at the same time.
That's true. But it has the gatekeeper, and it has the creepy vibes.
It has the final girl.
But there's something about the tone that just isn't a slasher. Now,
because
what is that?
Slashers are about suspense. They're built out of giallos, which are built out of Hitchcock. And so in that way, slashers are about this building suspense and these one-by-one murders. I often said slashers are like the last act of a Hitchcock movie.
Right.
So like Halloween, if you think about it, is kind of just the last 10 minutes of Rear Window, where he's watching her in the house and he sees the killer come behind her and then he comes into his house.
Sure.
It's all that slow chase cat and mouse game over the course of like usually one night in a dark environment. And Texas Chainsaw Massacre, there's no cat and mouse. There's a lot of chasing, but there's not a lot of like slow, subtle buildup. There's a lot of very aggressive, active violence.
Yeah, and I think for me, slasher films feel like you are very much in this nostalgia, like you're looking back into the past, like you're looking toward your childhood almost, because they're about puberty, because they're about suburbia, and we grew up in suburbia. Sometimes they're about summer camp. We went to summer camp, stuff like that. Whereas Texas Chainsaw begins with a distinctly apocalyptic feel. It feels like it's Mad Max. We're at like the edge of society, the edge of civilization, and in a time where it's almost kind of like giving us this notion that like 1974 is the last year on Earth.
Well, it opens with, these two skeletons that have been pulled up, or one skeleton's been pulled out of the ground and like desecrated. And then we see this old drunk at a graveyard talking, and we have these weird characters, and it's a setting that shouldn't feel familiar to you.
Things happen hereabout they don't tell about. I see things. You see, they say it's just an old man talking. You laugh at an old man. There's them that laughs and knows better.
And also, there is a news report going about the body snatchings, and in addition, a bunch of other horrific crimes, as though the world is descending into chaos, And then the title comes across very like you're watching a snuff film, like you're watching some VHS tape you got from a weirdo. Then in the car, one of the girls is talking about Saturn in retrograde. There's this whole just like apocalyptic tone right off the bat. I don't feel like slashers have an apocalyptic tone.
No, they're very self-contained.
Yeah, and they're also very much like a slice of the world we live in, whereas Texas Chainsaw feels like the edge of the world, the end of the world.
And it's the edge of society.
Right.
It's the absolute fringes of society.
Now, you will get some of that later on in slashers that we'll talk about in part 3 when we talk about slashers that take place in the forest. Those can have, especially like Just Before Dawn.
But those are not main run slashers. Those are mostly kind of peripheral to the main bulk of slashers.
Sure, but those, they borrow from Texas Chainsaw with the edge of society, outside of society, end of human society themes, And we'll get to that a little bit more in Chapter 3 of this episode. So Texas Chainsaw, after we see this body, we meet our characters. They're a bunch of kids. It's the standard slasher setup of 5 kids, 2 girls.
It's 4 kids.
It's 4. You're right. It's 2. No, it's
5. You're right.
3 boys, 2 girls. And they're in a van trying to go to their granddad's old house in Texas. So we got the old dark house element going on. And they encounter a hitchhiker early on in the film. And being hippies, first they pass a slaughterhouse and they comment on the stench of it. And then immediately after passing the slaughterhouse, they pick up this guy who's hitchhiking. And one of them says, don't pick him up. He'll smell like nothing but slaughterhouse.
Yeah.
Sure enough, he is a strange dude.
Yeah. And that's the other thing about this movie is that's the classic setup of a early like omen of bad things to come, but also it just establishes that this takes place in a world of grossness.
Yeah,
this takes place in a world where everything is dirty and gross and smelly and nasty.
Yeah. No, right off the bat, it's. I mean, the first shot after the title is Franklin, who's a guy in a wheelchair trying to take a piss when a truck rolls by and spooks him down the hill, so he spills his piss all over himself. So right off, we've got this pathetic, sad, gross image. And this movie wants you to know right off the bat that it's ugly. Whereas a lot of giallo gialli and slashers are
and Hitchcock movies
are very pretty.
They're pretty. They're about pretty people who are well dressed who happen to be in a dangerous situation.
Texas Chainsaw wants you to know right off the bat that this is an ugly, gross movie.
Yeah,
and that is what it is.
Mm-hmm. And also, even the invalid character is not very sympathetic. He's an obnoxious asshole.
They call him an invalid. That's an outdated term.
I know.
That's
why I said it.
The guy in the wheelchair.
But even he, he's not like a nice guy. No, he's gross and obnoxious, and no one is very sympathetic.
No, they're kind of mean to him, and he's kind of mean right back.
Yeah.
It's this nasty vibe between them.
Yeah,
too.
It's all designed to make you uncomfortable, and that goes hand in hand with the way it's shot. It's shot very verite, but also there's some really good designed cinematography. There's a scene where Franklin's rolling around their grandfather's house making these awful pig noises, and it's shot from this incredibly high angle, mounted on the bottom of his wheelchair, and you're seeing an obnoxious thing, and you're looking at it from a dizzying angle, and the whole movie's kind of designed to make you nauseous and uncomfortable.
Right, and a great example is that the hitchhiker that they pick up in the beginning, he's automatically, as soon as he gets in the car, they can tell that he's weird, and that he's acting
he's got
strange.
This huge birthmark on his face.
And he's talking about head cheese, which was the original title for the movie. He keeps talking about, my brother makes the best head cheese. My brother,
cow brains.
It's like a bunch of pieces from the inside of the skull and other parts of the cow boiled into a gelatinous loaf, almost like bread. I've had it. It's pretty good with beer, honestly.
Oh my God.
Some good brown mustard and beer. Head cheese is actually pretty tasty. but anyway, he's like, you guys should all come to dinner at my house and eat some really good head cheese. And they're like, nah, dude, we're cool.
You like it.
Yeah.
My brother makes head cheese. You like it.
They're like, we're cool. Then he takes a picture of them and he's tries to charge them $2 for it. He's like, I took a good picture. Pay me $2. It has all the feel of getting hassled by locals in a foreign country where you're like, because that's what it is.
Yeah.
Rural Texas for these kids is like a foreign country, and they're out of their element. Then he cuts himself with a knife, and then he takes the photo and blows it up using this saltpeter or some kind of firecracker thing, and then he cuts Franklin.
Yeah.
And they kick him out of the car. It's a very uncomfortable sequence. Yeah. It's really, really uncomfortable. After that, by the way, Franklin refers to them as a whole family of Draculas.
I think we just picked up Dracula.
I just want to say that in this scene, it occurred to me while this guy's talking about his brother making this really good head cheese, you'll like it, that it's kind of sad that Ed Gein never really had a family.
Well, he did. They were just awful, and then they all died.
Yeah. I want to go back to Child of God for a moment and see that when discussing Ed Gein, the people of 1973 and 1974 who wanted to talk about Ed Gein, he was seeing a new vogue in 1973, which would recur in the 90s with Silence of the Lambs and the novels of Thomas Harris.
Well, this is all 20 years after the real Ed Gein in the 50s.
One of the early descriptions of the home that Lester Ballard, who is Cormac McCarthy's Ed Gein figure, lives in, has very much the same post-apocalyptic tone as the beginning of Texas Chainsaw. I'm going to read it here. Were there darker provinces of night, he would have found them. Lying with his fingers plugged in the bores of his ears against the strident cheeping of the myriad black crickets with which he kept household in the barren cabin. One night on his pallet, while half asleep, he heard something scamper through the room and vault ghostly, he saw, struggling erect, through the open window. He sat there looking after it, but it was gone. He could hear foxhounds in full cry, tortured wails and yelps nigh unto agony coming up the creek, up the valley. They flooded into the cabin yard in a pandemonium of soprano howls and crashing brush. Ballard, standing naked, saw by palest starlight the front door fill from floor sill up with bawling dogs. They hung there for a moment in a pulsing frame of piebald fur, and then bowed through and filled the room, circled once with rising volume, dog on dog, and then swept out the window, howl on howl, carrying first the muntins, then the sash, leaving a square and naked hole in the wall and a ringing in his ear. So even when Cormac McCarthy chooses to address Ed Gein, he depicts him in this almost post-society world. This world where animals have reign and wilderness is everything, and he exists more as an animal than as a man. Basically, after they drop off the hitchhiker and they get to this gas station and are told that the gas station attendants act a lot like the gas station attendants in Hills Have Eyes, right? Where they're like, you don't want to keep going. You don't want to go this way. Go a different way. These pretty girls you got with you don't want to hang out in this old dark house, right? But they go anyway. And all of the promises that this fun weekend was going to have don't seem so fun. As Franklin says, if I have any more fun, I don't know if I can stand it. Franklin tells them that there's a cool watering hole they can go swim in. Watering hole is dry as fuck. It's
Yeah.
just dried up. It's just a gorge. The house is full of like bone ornaments randomly.
So it is in that way is a lot like a precursor to a Cabin in the Woods movie.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. It sort of is. And so they wander over to the house next door to look for something more interesting to do. They find a tooth on the porch. One of the boyfriends is like, hey, I got something for you. And she's like, that's gross. And she goes and sits down. He continues into the house.
This is where the movie departs completely from any sort of Hitchcockian notions of suspense. Instead of us seeing, increasingly claustrophobic shots and quicker jumps in the editing and ratcheting up of music as the kill approaches, he walks in and all of a sudden we are interrupted by this giant monster killer in our face with a mallet. We hear pig noises and he strikes him in the head. There's no building of strings. There's no there's none of that. There's just a very believable depiction of a murder taking place.
Incredibly voyeuristic.
Yeah.
You feel like it's something you're seeing by accident.
It's not an orchestrated film. Exactly.
Yeah.
That's why it makes it all the more disturbing
Right.
and unsettling.
And worth mentioning that the first murder in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is actually a hammer kill.
Yeah, there's only one chainsaw murder in the whole movie.
Well, the next thing that happens is the girl continues into the house to search for her boyfriend and stumbles into the ultimate hoarder's nest of bones and chickens and feathers and cages, and she discovers Ed Gein's little, museum of horrors.
Right.
And then Leatherface, they call him. He is wearing, by the way, he's this big dude, very large dude, with a face turned into a mask. Someone else's face turned into a mask over his own face.
Right, and he just makes pig noises.
And he's wearing an apron. And I think there's a real Jack the Ripper reference there, because Jack the Ripper was for a little while in his time referred to as Old Leather Apron, And so, yeah, he was.
I didn't know that.
That was one of his nicknames. And so I think this is sort of a Jack the Ripper thing. And then he's wearing a leather face, and he's got an apron, that kind of thing.
That's just a butcher thing. In
Right,
general.
it's a butcher thing. So he's got the butcher thing going. Then he picks the girl up, and he impales her on a meat hook and proceeds to cut up her boyfriend in front of her with a chainsaw while she screams. And then we can assume he butchers her with a chainsaw.
Well, we see her later in the icebox.
What I forget. What does she look like?
They open an icebox and her body spasms out of it.
But is she dead?
Yeah, totally dead. But it's weird because she seems alive for a moment.
Right.
But it's just a spasm.
So in that case, we have a chainsaw massacre.
Well, they all get chainsawed afterwards. Franklin's the only one who gets killed with a chainsaw. They're wheeling Franklin through the woods. This is the part where it gets dark. And this is the part that kind of influences other slasher movies as well, is that it gets dark and the other two haven't come back, and Franklin and his sister are wondering, what has happened, and the boyfriend are wondering what has happened.
It's also worth mentioning that I think that the maltreatment of Franklin and the struggle Franklin has to use his wheelchair in this way pre-handicap law house that has no ramps or anything, and also they're wheeling Franklin through bracken and wild grass, not on any kind of road. So he's becoming more and more incapable in this environment. Has something to do with the struggles of the differently abled, because he is in a wheelchair
and Leatherface is very clearly
intellectually disabled.
Unwell.
Yeah, he's had a tough childhood and he's come up all wrong. And so mental health and different disabilities are a major theme in this, And then the one disabled, the mentally disabled, kills the physically disabled.
Right, and the physically disabled is murdered while the woman who can use her legs runs away.
Well, what would you have done?
No, I'm not saying. I'm not judging. I'm just saying that it's interesting.
Then we get a long chainsaw chase before
Yeah.
she takes shelter with who she thinks is safe, the local gas station guy, or is it the cop?
It's the guy who owns the gas station.
But isn't he also the cop?
Yeah, I don't know.
Anyway, turns out he's a member of the same family.
Well, she knows because she sees a corpse burning in the fireplace.
Yeah. And then he takes her to dinner. Turns out she's going to have head cheese after all.
Right, and this is where the movie, the whole movie is not in anything we've seen before, but it really focuses on the torment and the psychological torment of this.
It's not about suspense.
It's about brutal, violent torment.
It's also about the worst dinner party of all time.
Yeah, so this could even be called predecessor of torture porn, but it's all psychological torture.
Yeah, but you know what? It also, in a much more brutal sense, feels kind of like the old Dark House or something like that, where it's like, oh, damn it, I got stuck in this house with this shitty, weird family.
Yeah, but they take it to a real horror level, where all those old Dark House movies were just, cartoony.
It's also, as I said before, Ed Gein was a very lonely guy. what if there were like 6 Ed Geins? And in that sense, it's more so based on like the Bloody Benders, which was that famous frontier murderer family that lived around the same time as Laurel Ingalls Wilder. And the Bloody Benders murdered like many people in their murder motel. And so it relates to that as well. It's kind of feeding into, once again, the way that later slashers will feed into Americana more in a Norman Rockwell sense. This one feeds into the Americana of like early H.H. Holmes, Bloody Benders, frontier
The other thing it does is
murderers.
It exploits the idea of in exploitation or redneck exploitation, because we don't understand. The whole idea is that there are these people who live separate from society and we don't understand their way of life. So what if their way of life was brutal murder and cannibalism? And that is this family's way of life. The thing the way they're tormenting her isn't some sick flight of fancy. It is actually their routine. So the movie itself has a very non-slasher vibe, we've decided, but it has a lot of elements that would later influence slashers and become part of slashers. One big part of that is the final girl and the final chase. The whole movie, the last act, is the final girl outrunning and outsmarting her attackers, which will then be recreated in the last act of most slasher movies we'll see to come.
I can't remember which actor it was. I think it might be the one who played the first guy they meet, the head cheese guy, who said that he was in the Vietnam War and filming the dinner scene for Texas Chainsaw was the worst experience of his life.
Yeah, well, apparently the guy who played Leatherface actually went crazy at one point during the scene, and he cut the girl for real because he forgot like who he was and what he was doing.
He had like complete dissociation.
Yeah, and the director said like cut her, meaning pretend to cut her, but he actually did because he completely had no idea what was going on anymore.
So Tobe Hooper really pushed. By the way, Tobe Hooper died this year.
Yeah,
rest in peace.
And 2017.
Terry Gross recently broadcast an old interview she did with Tobe Hooper where he said that he actually tried to get a PG rating for the Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
Well, thank God that didn't happen.
Well, but he said that if he had known he was going to get an R rating no matter what, he would have put way more violence in the movie.
Well, I'm also glad that didn't happen.
Yeah, right. It's a good
because
restraint.
The movie is like perfect.
It's not necessarily like the goriest movie ever made.
No, it's not, but it's so much more disturbing than a lot of much gorier films.
Right. And
it's all in the style.
And also, I think this is a really important point to note that Texas Chainsaw stands at the threshold. This episode, part 2, is the turning point, and Texas Chainsaw Massacre is not the first slasher, but it is the threshold before slashers. Mm-hmm. And from Texas Chainsaw, genres depart in a forked road. One way, we go to slasher films, which we'll get to in our next chapter, and one way, we go to splatter films,
right,
which is a different genre entirely. Splatter films are about gore and murder and the almost pornographic violence, whereas slasher films are about suspense.
Yeah.
And that's our defining distinction.
And I should also say, just as a personal note, that Texas Chainsaw Massacre is maybe my favorite horror movie of all time. So it's hard to talk about it objectively in this regard.
Really? Your favorite of all time?
I think probably.
Suicide Club is mine. But I remember Brooke's younger sister Corey and her friend Wyatt came over. They were both 19. They had seen a lot of modern horror films. We had just gone to the Pumpkin Patch last year. It was like 2 or 3 years ago. And I showed them the original Texas Chainsaw, and I expected them to be kind of bored because it's an old film. They were terrified.
Yeah.
I was amazed at how effective this film still is, even for young people who are used to
No, because it's very, very well made.
Yeah, even to people who are used to way more intense and like modern films, you know? Yeah, it's a fantastic film. But let's move on to what actually constitutes the first slasher of all time. If we're going to say, we've been talking about proto-slashers, we've been talking about films that influenced slashers, we've been talking about films like Texas Chainsaw that opened the door for slashers. But what is the first slasher movie, Harry? The answer is, well, we'll tell you in Chapter 2. Chapter 2, The Madonna.
Little baby bunting, daddy's gone a-hunting, gone to fetch a rabbit skin to wrap his baby Agnes in.
The first slasher film came out later that same year, just in time for the holidays, and that's Black Christmas from 1974.
Yes, Black Christmas is the first time we see all of the elements and the tone in place, and with a very heavy focus on feminism.
Right. So Black Christmas has every trope that we could reasonably say defines a slasher film. It has one-by-one murders. It has a maniac killer. It has a POV from the killer's perspective. It stars teenage girls. It has unknown deaths, meaning that the characters aren't aware that there are murders taking place. It has creepy phone calls. It has a final girl. It has a chase scene. And it has heavy sexual undertones.
And it's all about growing up and realizing the way the world wants to victimize you and the power you have. I'll get into a little bit more of that because that's our Chapter 2 theory, our Madonna theory. I'll get into that. I want to prelude by saying that Black Christmas falls into a long tradition of Christmas horror. You know this already, even though you don't know you know it. Old school Christmas, before the modern...
Dickensian old school.
Like Dickensian Christmas. I mean, think about it. Christmas Carol has ghosts, right?
Yeah.
Old school Christmas was very similar to Halloween.
Yeah, there's a lot of focus on urban legends, ghost stories, and horror.
You already know this because...
There'll be scary ghost stories and tales of the glories of Christmases long, long ago.
And because in the early 70s, even before Black Christmas, we had a couple different Christmas horror movies. They already were a thing. In 1972, there were 3. There was a TV movie with Sally Field called
Home for the Holidays.
Home for the Holidays. Let's talk about that for just a second.
Well, Home for the Holidays is kind of a proto-slasher. It's a made-for-TV movie about these sisters who go visit their horrible, abusive father, who they suspect killed their mother.
Who is being perhaps poisoned by his new wife.
Yeah, and there's a one-by-one killing structure, and they don't know that the murders are taking place. They think that the one girl leaves. They think the other girl died accidentally.
We've got a raincoat-clad killer, which is
very giallo,
like the bird with the crystal plumage, or others later on. It was not good.
No, it was boring as shit. I can't watch TV movies. I don't care.
Dude, there are some good ones.
No,
come on, Bad Ronald.
No, you know what the best made-for-TV movies are? Ju-On and Ju-On 2.
And It.
Yeah, okay. But I don't know. Made-for-TV, I want to skip on this podcast.
Well, I'm going to be talking about another made-for-TV movie later on, and I very much liked it. Anyway, another one of this time of 1972, before Black Christmas, was Silent Night, Bloody Night.
Right, which also has a bit more of a giallo vibe. It's got murders. It's got pretty brutal murders, but it's kind of more about very complex character relationships.
Yes, it feels more like a giallo, yes. It's all about this complicated family dynasty. Someone gets burned alive, and then Actually, Silent Night, Bloody Night was surprisingly good.
Well, it also had the past trauma, which is also present in Black Christmas. A trauma from long ago being the inciting incident for these murders today.
All of us believe that his death was an accident. No one knew that another person had come to Butler House that Christmas.
Honestly, and this is not to be confused with the later, which we'll talk about a little bit in part 3, Silent Night, Deadly Night.
No.
This is Silent Night, Bloody Night, which is, an earlier one from 72. It's actually not bad, and it shares this really cool plot line that you get from the Dr. Tarr story by Edgar Allan Poe about the inmates break out of an asylum and take positions where they act like doctors and lawyers and stuff and pretend to be normal people. So Silent Night, Bloody Night's not bad. It's a good Christmas horror story from 72. Our favorite Christmas horror story was from an EC comic published in 54 in the Vault of Horror.
Which we know from Tales from the Crypt's opening episode by Robert Zemeckis.
The 90s one. But it was actually made into a film in 72 by Amicus Pictures. And that was Tales from the Crypt, 72.
Right.
And the story, which has been retold twice, and originally in Vault of Horror, was called And All Through the House.
And it's about an escaped maniac from a mental institution, which is a trope we'll see later on, who dresses up as Santa and comes to assault the woman in her home. And the whole, this is just a segment in an anthology film, but the whole segment plays out like a final girl chase from a slasher movie.
We interrupt this program for a special announcement. A man described as a homicidal maniac has escaped from the hospital for the criminally insane. He is 6 foot 3 inches tall, 210 pounds, dark eyes, bald, and may be wearing a Santa Claus costume taken from a shop in Burley. All residents of the county are warned to be on the lookout for this man, and to phone the police if they see him. We now continue our program of carols for Christmas Eve.
Well, it's only like 15 minutes, right?
Yeah.
So, like, exactly. It's actually quite good. I remember one day in October, my students were like, Nick, we're bored today. Show us a horror movie. And I was like, well, the period's only 40 minutes. I'll show you an episode of Tales from the Crypt.
Mm-hmm.
And I showed them the Bob Zemeckis and All Through the House. Dude, they were terrified.
It's pretty spooky. Yeah. It's a lot scarier than this 1972 version, I got to be honest. The 72 version's not very scary.
No. But it's the same concept, and we'll discuss it later when we talk about Silent Night, Deadly Night.
Mm-hmm.
Not to be confused with the also good Silent Night, Bloody Night from 72.
You already said that.
So let's get to Black Christmas. All right. Black Christmas is a unique gem. It is wonderfully enigmatic.
It's like almost a perfect movie. It's got every element of structure and content working together to be the platonic ideal of a slasher movie.
The thing I like most about it is that it is most perfectly the living metaphor, which is what all great slashers will be. The best slashers are gorily psychoanalytic. They borrow from these deep repressed fears, repressed sexual development, all that kind of stuff coming into play. But the main theory of slasher films that we get here, we've talked about slasher villains like the Bat. We've talked about final girls. Now we really get the final distillation of them versus each other. This is a almost like legendary feminine energy versus a like legendary infamous masculine energy.
Mm-hmm.
Anima, animus.
It's a lot about women's sexuality being threatened and their own control over their bodies being threatened.
Here's the basic theory of all good slasher films, in my opinion, and we get this distilled very distinctly in the films we're going to talk about in this chapter. Black Christmas, Alice Sweet Alice, Carrie. Films about women who come of age and have two realizations simultaneously, kind of a bad news, good news situation. Bad news. As they become women, as their bodies and their minds develop, they realize that the entire world of men in not every man, but like the entire world of men as a monolith wants to victimize and slash them. Mm-hmm. Whether that means murder, whether that means sex, whether that means forced sex or abuse. The world of men is as a monolith out to get them. The good news, the other realization is they have unbelievable power and unbelievable strength to fight back.
So you said anima, animus, and I want to talk about that for a second. That is the story of what you're talking about right now. It's a thing in mythology that we all have our animal side inside of us. The anima, the female animal, and the animus is the male animal. And female heroines, in their hero's journey, they must tame the animus inside of them. And in male hero journeys, the male hero must be softened and shown compassion by the anima inside of him. So in a slasher film, we have the final girl taming her animus and the slasher killer who is the untamable man.
Right. He fails to tame his anima.
He fails to be softened.
He fails to succumb to his anima.
Right.
So basically, the idea is that as a man grows, he must soften and embrace a feminine energy.
And as a woman grows, she must experience her own power and like tame the wildness inside of her.
So these are films about women who fully embrace their animus and become powerful against men who refuse to be tamed and who refuse to soften.
Right, and then they have their arrested development and their psychosexual nature.
And most slasher villains are like children trapped in violent men's bodies.
Yes.
Yeah. Exactly. So this distills that greatly. Also, I want to be very clear when we what we mean is, of course, we could say allegory, where one thing stands for another. But this isn't like Animal Farm, where a pig is supposed to be Stalin. This is a living metaphor in the sense that in this film, which is about abortion, the woman, Jess, our final girl, wants to have an abortion, and her abusive boyfriend doesn't want her to have it. There is not a allegory for that in The Killer in the Sorority House. The killer is given life by this situation. He comes to life as a living metaphor for what is happening in her subplot. So let's unpack that. The opening shot of the film, we hear Christmas carols.
We see the outside of the sorority house.
Yes, the sorority house, Pi Kappa Sig. I don't know if that's a real sorority, but if it is, whoop whoop, Pi Kappa Sig.
All right.
And to get really psychoanalytical, and maybe this is a little too on the nose, but since this film is about pregnancy and a major subplot and a major motif of it is pregnancy, the opening shot, we see the sorority and we have a POV shot, obviously, of our maniac killer sneaking in, and I see that as the sperm fertilizing the egg.
Right, and I would be with you because he almost never leaves the sorority, but he does leave the sorority at one point.
Yeah, it's true. He does.
So that kind of... Otherwise, I would go with that.
But he tries to fertilize through the front, and then someone says, "Who opened the door?" And he instead, we never see the killer. We never really fully see the killer. We never really find out who the killer is. But we know from the POV shot that the killer then abandons the front door as a way in. There's a Christmas party going on with the girls who aren't going home for Christmas. So there's about 5 girls left in the sorority house, right? These are the girls who are staying over the Christmas break on campus. Mm-hmm. And he instead goes up the side and climbs into the attic.
Right, the attic that is littered with a lot of children's junk for some reason. It's got a Ferris wheel horse or a rocking horse. It's got dolls. It's clear that this house maybe wasn't always a sorority house and used to have a family in it.
Yeah, and maybe this guy used to live there.
Right.
We never find out.
No.
In fact, I think that one of the best aspects of this film is it's enigmatic and never really gives us a full explanation.
Yeah, it's just the imagery that matters. In the attic are the things that a child would have in their nursery.
Right. So then upon nesting, upon this sperm entering the ovum, entering the egg, finding its home in the attic, it immediately gets hold of the phone and it calls the house that it's already inside.
Right.
Now, I say it or they because I assume this is
It's a white male. You can tell
you can tell by like
you see the hands, you hear the voice.
Right, and by the nature of the crime too.
Right.
But this killer does not have a very good sense of identity.
No.
Because the first phone call that is a very iconic scene that the killer makes shifts through a bunch of different identities.
Right, which is very Norman Bates Psycho. He has at least 3. He has Billy, Agnes, the baby, and the mother, the father.
The father.
Yeah.
We don't really get details, but the phone calls keep being of the nature of Billy did something to Agnes, and father needs to know where the baby is.
The idea is that this child, Billy, probably killed his baby sister, Agnes.
Probably, yeah. And maybe in the same house.
Mm-hmm.
We don't get more details than just what's said over the phone.
Yeah. Which is all that you need to put it together in your head.
Exactly. So the opening, I see that as since I see the opening shot of the POV entering the sorority house as the sperm, fertilizing the egg, because the sorority house represents this bastion of femininity, and then taking up in the attic as the phone calls begin. It's as though the zygote is starting to form into a personality. It's starting to take form.
And they get more and more frequent as the film goes on.
Exactly. Although, we know that the phone calls precede the invasion of the sorority because when Jess, our final girl...
She says it's the moaner.
She says it's him again, the moaner. So This is not the first time this has happened. And I just want to play this scene because it's one of the creepiest... scary phone call scenes in film history still to this day. And I just want to warn everyone, there's some really disturbing sounds and things said in this scene, so if you're sensitive to sexual harassment and all that, this isn't for you. But here we go. This is the first creepy phone call from Black Christmas.
Hey, quiet! It's him again! The moaner!
He's expanded his act. Could that be one person? No, Claire, that's the Mormon Tabernacle Choir doing their annual obscene phone call.
Let me stick.
Not bad.
Suck my juicy cock. I'll come over. And you can suck it. Okay.
Listen, you pervert, why don't you go over to Lambakai? They could use a little of this.
You piggy cunt. You want my fat cock too?
Oh, why don't you go find a wall socket and stick your tongue in it? That'll give you a charge.
I'll stick my tongue up your pretty pussy.
You fucking creep!
I'm going to kill you.
We hear the voice go from bestial animal squealing, wailing, to a woman, motherhood, early femininity, to an adolescent male threatening to do all these dirty sexual things in a very adolescent way. But it's not funny, even though the things they're saying are things that like some gross teenage boy might say. The way that the camera pans over all the girls' faces, it's just dark and upsetting. And then finally, a mature man who says one line.
Yeah, and the line is, "I'm going to kill you."
Very matter of fact.
Which he stands to it. He does kill the woman he's talking to on the phone later in the film. So we get that male voice is the voice of actual direct action.
And this is kind of like a summation of male development in a very short period. You know, we get from the very early stages onto maturity in the most negative sense of the term.
Yeah.
An abusive male figure,
Mm-hmm.
you know? It's just really unsettling and dark. And right away we have this, you know, as our setup.
Right, and the abusive male figure will be the dominating theme throughout the rest of the film. As we get our main plot, which is that Jess, our final girl, is pregnant with an unwanted child, and her abusive boyfriend isn't too happy about her decision to get an abortion.
Let's now break down the Madonna horror complex. This is a complex that a lot of young boys have. I'm sure we had it at some point. The earlier you get over this, the better and the more mature a person you are.
Right, but there are a lot of men who never get over it, and it defines their entire lives.
Slasher villains never get over this.
No.
Basically this maladjusted idea that women fit into two binary categories. They're either a Madonna, like the Virgin Mary, or they're a whore. And there's no nuance, there's no other degrees.
And obviously, if you're a whore, then you're condemnable and deserve punishment. And if you're a Madonna, then you're praiseworthy. But of course, no woman can ever be either one or the other entirely, so everyone is condemnable and everyone is deserving of cleansing.
Exactly. And this is also where a lot of people who denounce or attach a stigma to slasher films say that slasher films are these morality plays that champion virgins and innocent women who are sexually modest and punish women who are sexually promiscuous. And I couldn't disagree more. I really think that that is a total simplification of what's happening in slasher films. And slasher films are actually about how that attitude is incredibly maladapted, because that's the attitude that slasher villains have.
Yeah, I think Black Christmas is way ahead of its time, both as a film and in its filmmaking techniques and in its kind of progressiveness towards gender and like abortions in general.
Right. Well, let's break down. There is a Madonna figure and there is a bad girl figure in this film. We have the Madonna figure with Jess, and we have the bad girl figure with Barb. On the surface level, people would reduce it and say, well, Jess is the virginal one and Barb is the slutty one. That's not true at all.
No, because Jess is pregnant. And Barb talks a lot about sex, but we never see anything.
Yeah, no, Barb. We never see Barb actually with a man. She's just kind of like the loudmouthed adolescent who keeps talking about fellatio and premature ejaculation. And also, the other thing to note about Barb is she's just shitty.
Yeah, she's just a mean, like, nasty person. She's not like more sexual necessarily.
No, Barb, who's their bad girl, she's, first of all, the first thing we see with her is her having a conversation with her mother or her stepmother on the phone, which seems very unhappy and negative. So we know she's an unhappy person, and she's not going home because of some issue with her family. Additionally, she's rude and mean to the other girls. She is brave in the sense that in that scene that we just listened to, she stands up to the slasher victim, caller, and that is a good representation of like feminine strength, you know, in that scene. But soon after that, the first victim says to her, well, I don't know, that local town girl did just get raped recently. We should maybe be a little more rated.
And she says townies can't get raped.
She can't rape a townie.
Yeah.
And immediately we realize Barb is a real shithead.
Barb sucks.
That was sick. I really don't think you should provoke somebody like that, Barb. Oh, listen, this guy's minor league in the city. I get 2 of those a day. Maybe. But you know, that town girl was raped a couple of weeks ago. Darling, you can't rape a townie. You really are too much, Barb. Oh, come on. This is a sorority house, not a convent.
What a fucking shitty thing to say.
Oh.
You know?
Even though it's beautiful Margot Kidder playing her.
Yeah, it's Margot Kidder. Meanwhile, Jess, played by the lovely Olivia Hussey, whose most famous role was Juliet in Theater of Blood play number 2.
Oh, yeah.
Romeo and Juliet, which Steve Martin once met Olivia Hussey and said, "You were in my favorite film of all time." And she said, "Oh, Romeo and Juliet?" And he said, "No, Black Christmas. I've seen it 23 times." Jess is not a perfect virgin. She's in a sexual relationship. She's pregnant. But the difference between her and Barb is not anything to do with sexual morality, as people who don't like slashers would say. She's just a good person. She's very maternal, once again getting back to the Madonna, the Virgin Mary.
Mm-hmm.
She's very maternal with the other sisters in the house. She's a caretaker. She cares about people. Even with Peter, who we'll get to in a bit, who's her abusive boyfriend, she's very mature and straightforward with the way she talks to him. And she's just a better person. So I just wanted to get rid of that. The slasher in the attic definitely sees them as a Madonna and a whore.
Mm-hmm.
He probably lusts after Jess in this motherly way. But that's the way he sees things. I hope it's not the way you see things when you watch a slasher film. Don't get tricked by the POV shot into being a slasher villain yourself. The first kill is a girl who says she's going to go meet with her dad, goes upstairs to pack. This is sort of our virgin sacrifice, if you really want to get into that dynamic. She is a little stuck up, and Barb makes fun of her for being not very sexually
She calls her a
active.
professional virgin.
Professional virgin, right.
Yeah.
And meanwhile, and then at the exact same moment that she says that, the house mother bursts in. And she
Who
says,
is a sneak drinker, we should mention. She has bottles hidden all over the house.
And Barb says, speaking of professional virgins. And that's important because when we see our first girl die, she's suffocated by the killer in the attic with plastic wrap and then immediately put into a rocking chair.
Mm-hmm.
And then it cuts to a shot of the house mother. And so I feel like it's this kind of image that he's trapping her in maidenhood. He's trapping her in this old maid status that the house mother already has.
Yeah.
Additionally, I think of Sylvia Plath, the bell jar.
Well, he later infantilizes her, which we'll get to, when he gives her the doll and sings her a lullaby.
Yeah. He treats her like his baby sister Agnes, maybe. Yeah.
But I think the main theme throughout this film is the abortion theme.
We then introduce that theme. Jess has a phone call with her boyfriend Peter. This is when we notice that her sweater has hands over her breasts on the sweater, as though male hands are already possessing her. Not to get too imagistic, but Black Christmas is an image play, basically.
Yeah.
She tells Peter that she needs to talk to him. And when we first see them meeting together, there are clear signs of a bad relationship. We transition from a lullaby about little baby Bunting, whose father had to go kill a rabbit. I own rabbits. That hurts my feelings. Skin it to wrap the baby in, which relates directly to what the killer's doing. Mm-hmm. To Jess talking to her boyfriend and saying, "I'm pregnant." And he says,
"That's wonderful."
Yeah. We can see in this scene that Jess does not feel comfortable around Peter. Mm. We can already see signs of an abusive relationship.
He says, "That's wonderful. You have to keep it." And she says, "This is why I didn't want to tell you." So we already understand that their relationship is one where she's afraid to tell him very serious, important information.
She says, "I'm going to get an abortion." And he goes, "How can you say that? You haven't even asked me yet."
Yeah.
And she says, "I wasn't even going to tell you."
Mm-hmm.
And so he doesn't, understand her bodily sovereignty at all. He's just like, this is a decision that is entirely up to both of us. And if it's not unanimous between the two of us, then you can't do it. And she's like, no. I can do what I need to do. And I'm going to get an abortion. I don't mean to get too real, but there is a very real account, especially in an article I read called, and I'll cite it in the show notes, called "When Abuse is a Pregnant Belly Instead of a Bruise," or something like that. The exact headline will be in the notes. A lot of the times, instead of actual physical abuse, the way that some abusive relationships function is men get women pregnant without their knowledge, or force women to get abortions without their knowledge, or force women to not get abortions,
Yeah.
That's a way abuse also happens. And we definitely see that with Peter and Jess.
Well, then the pregnancy and the unwanted pregnancy becomes the living metaphor with the maniac in the attic.
I'm pregnant.
What?
I'm pregnant.
Jess, that's fantastic.
I don't want it.
You don't want it?
No. I'm going to have an abortion.
You can't make a decision like that. You haven't even asked me.
I wasn't even going to tell you.
Jess, I want us to have a baby.
Peter, I can't.
Oh, Christ, Jess. Don't you ever consider anyone but yourself?
I've thought this out very carefully, and I know what I'm going to do.
Do you know how important this afternoon is to me?
Yes, I do.
Why don't you just get out of here? Jess? I want to talk to you tonight.
There's nothing to discuss, Peter.
I think there is.
I'm not going to change my mind.
We'll see. Will you be there at 9 o'clock?
Yes.
Okay, I'll see you tonight.
So this is where Harry and I have to have a little debate. I think the maniac in the attic is the living embodiment of the baby in her womb.
Which makes sense because if you think of the house as the womb and him entering like the sperm, and he's surrounded by babyish objects,
right,
and he's associated with babyhood, but he is also a maniac killer who is the grown-up version of a boy who killed his baby sister.
Right.
And he sings about killing babies, and he treats his victim, Claire, like a baby when he sings a lullaby to her. So I also think he might be a metaphor or a living interpretation of the act of killing babies.
Well, and we want to be clear. I think we have to be politically clear on this point. We're pro-choice, and so we believe that, like, we don't believe that abortion is killing a baby. And
no, but Peter does, and he says it very straightforward. There's a part where he cries and says, "Don't kill the baby."
Yeah, and also the police even listen into Peter's phone call and say to Jess later, that's kind of a weird way to put it. Even in the 70s when abortion was more stigmatized than it is now, the police, and this is a Canadian film, so the laws are a little different, but the police say, killing the baby, that's kind of a weird way to put it.
Right.
Even the police say, that's a weird way to describe an abortion, you know? So a couple other things happen. Peter, the boyfriend, has his piano recital. It's weird minor keys, and he doesn't do well, and he destroys the piano.
The thing I didn't remember is there's the whole plot line with the missing high school girl that they then find in the park.
Right.
Dead. I forgot that was in the movie. But yeah, it's not just the college girls that our maniac is stalking, apparently.
And then the house mother is in the home, and she goes up in the attic because she hears the weird noises of Billy up there. And he swings a hook and gets her in the face with it hard. I remember writing an article, you can check it out in the extra section of cinematicoblivion.com, called Sociology, Black Christmas and the Ever-Looming Patriarchy, back in the day, where I made a lot of the same arguments I'm making now, and I had a commenter argue that kill represented the umbilical cord.
I mean, I don't know.
Who can say?
It doesn't matter at that point.
Yeah. Right after that, the killer trashes the attic in a very childlike fit sort of way.
While screaming and crying. It's pretty nuts.
And then Jess gets another phone call.
Hello? Hello? Who is this?
Please stop. Oh, God.
What do you want? Why are you doing this?
Filthy Billy! I know you're there, nasty Billy! You answer it, Billy!
Who are you? For God's sake, what are you doing?
I know what you did, Billy! Filthy Billy! 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 Billy!
Stop this! Oh, Jesus Christ. Mrs. Mack, are you home?
And this phone call sounds like just a mixture of voices. And this is where I really get the theory that the person in the attic is the living metaphor, because it sounds like a baby crying to stay alive. It's almost like Jess is being haunted from within herself.
Yeah.
At this point, Peter enters as like a major red herring. We think he might be the killer. Remember, he comes over.
But even we know as the audience that he's not, because he is on the steps while she's receiving the phone call.
Right. And Peter comes in, he says, we're going to get married. I'm dropping out of school and we're going to get married. And
he doesn't ask.
He doesn't ask. It's which is also a sign of the abusive relationship. Jess, in the most mature way, polite way, straightforward way possible, says, I do not want to marry you.
Yeah.
Do you remember when we first met?
You told me about your wanting to be a concert pianist, how it was your greatest dream. And I told you about some of the things that I wanted to do. I still want to do those things. You can't ask me to drop everything I've been working for and give up all my ambitions because your plans have changed. Be realistic. I can't marry you.
Sure you can. What does it change? We could be married. You could still do anything you wanted to do.
Peter, I don't want to marry you.
I have a future. I want an abortion.
Mhm.
This is what's happening. He throws the Christmas tree down and calls her a bitch and says, no, that's not how this is going to happen.
Mhm.
You know, he gets really, really furious about it. And he says, you're treating it like it's just like getting a wart removed.
Mhm.
And then a little after, she gets a creepy phone call.
Right, where Billy on the phone screams at her, like getting a wart removed.
After this, they agree to let the police bug the phone. The police start listening into their phone calls. There become these really cool shots of the phone guy wandering through.
I loved that. I loved they show you like the mechanical details of how phone tapping worked in 1974.
Once again, like without warning, with
Mhm.
all the procedural elements
Yeah.
of tracking the psycho killer. We see also around this time in the movie that Jess is really a Madonna figure. She maternally cares for all the other sisters. She checks to make sure they're okay. She holds them and comforts them as they freak
She brings
out.
Barb her asthma inhaler.
Right, and she talks to Phyllis or whatever about like she's like, I feel so sorry for Mr. Harrison, because this whole time Claire, the first girl who died, her father's looking for her.
Right.
He's looking for her around the sorority. He also represents kind of a domineering male figure, which I think signals back to this feminine versus
Yeah, but he's
masculine
more
energy.
tragic because we all, as the audience, know that his daughter's dead.
Yeah, and so they're crying for him, and Jess is comforting them. And then on top of all of this, the murders continue. Barb is up in her room, and she's got a glass menagerie like Tennessee Williams play. I don't know if you've heard or read Tennessee Williams play The Glass Menagerie, but a glass unicorn figures very prominently in it. And
he stabs her with the black glass unicorn while the children are singing Holy Night on the front porch. Really incredible murder scene.
It's called Silent Night.
What did I say?
Holy Night.
Whatever.
But
They do say Holy Night in the song.
Yeah, they also say all is calm, all is bright.
They're singing All is Bright while she gets murdered with a unicorn.
I think this is a perfect point to note what we've been talking about the difference between slashers and splatters. This film's gore is not excessive.
No, it's not very gory, and the real important thing is that the majority of the characters don't know that these murders are taking place. They think that Barb is asleep upstairs. They think that Claire is off with a boyfriend.
Yes.
It's unclear that murders are taking place, whereas
Yes.
in Texas Chainsaw Massacre, it becomes abundantly clear that murders are taking place about halfway through the film.
Right, exactly. And it continues without anyone knowing there's been any murders up until Jess is the only one left.
Yeah, just the only one left. She thinks it's obscene phone calls and Claire is missing.
Yes.
And then she finds out that there have been all these killings.
We get this amazing final sequence, whereas based on that old urban legend, Harry mentioned earlier how urban legends are a very important influence on these first slasher films, or this first slasher film. The Babysitter and the Man Upstairs is, of course, a classic slasher about a babysitter is at home with some kids. Babysitters will come up again in Chapter 4, and keeps getting creepy phone calls, like in Black Christmas. Has the police trace the phone call. They call back and say, get out of the house right now. The calls are coming from within the house. This has a double significance the way it's used in Black Christmas, because the calls are coming from within your body. Yeah. It is your fetus calling out, trying to murder everything around you in a desperate attempt to stay alive and to live on your own suffering. And that represents both the baby she doesn't want and the abusive relationship she can't get out of.
Yeah. And the final chase scene is really excellent. And it gives us another slasher trope, which is the tableau murders, when she comes into the room where Phyllis and Barb have been posed together.
Right. But before that even, she starts screaming their names up the stairs, and we get the shots we'll see later in John Carpenter films, which is the static shots of all the empty rooms.
Right, which is used super effectively in Halloween and then again in The Thing. In Black Christmas, it's a little bit more sparing and not quite as haunting as it is in those films. But it's a very good trope for the end of a slasher film.
I think there's something so scary about a room with no one in it. Not a room with one creepy person in it, but a room with no one. There's something really creepy about empty places.
Yeah, especially as a child.
Yeah, and the shots of these empty places with no one inside of them. The last line of the film, first off, Peter sees Jess cowering in the basement. He breaks in. We can assume, I guess, protectively.
Mm-hmm.
But she takes him to be the killer. Maybe he starts abusing her. We don't know. We cut away, and when the police arrive, she's killed him.
Right.
She has fully realized, against a world that's trying to victimize her own feminine power, and murdered him.
She's murdered him with a fire poker. Right. And she's holding his bloodied corpse, much like, as you pointed out, La Pieta, yes. Which even closer akins her to the Madonna figure.
Right. For those of you who don't know, La Pieta is a famous sculpture by...
It's a traditional art. It's a thing that's been done thousands of times.
The most famous one's by Michelangelo.
Yeah.
And it's in the Sistine Chapel, or it's in the Vatican. And it's the image of Mother Mary, the Madonna, holding the corpse of Jesus on her lap. And the last shot of Peter on Jess's lap looks exactly like La Pieta. Then the doctors and the police put her in a room to rest, and the camera pulls back and back and back into the empty places of the sorority, where we see the two bodies of Claire and the house mother upstairs, and we hear, Agnes, it's me, Billy.
And we know that our killer still exists within her.
We get no explanation.
Because she hasn't gotten the abortion yet.
Exactly.
So it's still alive inside of her.
Oh, the living metaphor.
But I want to say real quick how amazing that last scene is. It's so great. They give her a drug and they put her in bed, and everyone's standing around her, and they're all discussing, you know, the reporters are here. We have to go talk to the reporters, and I want to send an email. Not an email. I want to call the family and have them identify the bodies. I have to get the autopsy done by the morning. Oh, the father of Claire passes out from shock. And one by one, they all leave the room, and they turn the lights off as they go. And it's like a smaller version of the whole movie we just watched, where one by one Jess is being left alone in this house, and every character leaves till she's alone in the house with just her and the killer again, just like she was at the final scene. And we realize this time she's even more vulnerable because she's on drugs. And then as it pulls out of the house, we hear the phone ring again.
Agnes, it's me, Billy.
And the credits play as the phone just continues to ring.
Yeah.
What a fantastic movie. I fucking love Black Christmas.
No, Black Christmas is like a masterpiece. It's a horror... It's a brilliant horror film and a brilliant slasher film, and the thing that's so great about it is that it's really believable and tangible. It has yet to get cartoonish. Mm-hmm. Later slasher films where you get characters like Jason who are completely invincible monsters, and you have characters who are over the top with their drug use and their sex and their cartoonish caricatures. In this, you have believable characters and a believable killer in a believable environment, and it's really disturbing.
Totally. And it distills a lot of these qualities in a beautiful way about womanhood, about a girl becoming a woman. Mm-hmm. The same year as Black Christmas came out, a little author who wasn't well known at the time with a lot of potential named Stevie King, they never called him Stevie, but Stephen King published his first novel the same year that Black Christmas came out. In 1974, he published Carrie. And Carrie was made into a film 3 years later in 1977. And Carrie distills a lot of the same themes we're talking about.
If you have a taste for terror, you have a date with Carrie.
So Carrie is a lot less of a slasher movie and more of a dark teen drama with a supernatural element and a climactic ending. The movie focuses on a young girl coming of age and becoming aware of the psychic powers that she has, while simultaneously living this very tormented and repressed life at the hands of her overly zealous Christian mother and her abusive classmates.
Stephen King really knew how to distill these ideas to total symbol play, since the opening of the novel and the Brian De Palma film are her having her first period.
But it's not just her having her first period. It is her, this is the way I saw it, masturbating in the shower and discovering blood on her hands. And it is simultaneously the joys of coming of age and butting heads with the shame of coming of age.
I never thought of it that way.
Which will also be the torment of her teen years and the power that she discovers within herself.
Yeah, and also immediately she starts freaking out and saying, I'm dying to the other girls, because she doesn't know what a period is because her mother is so religious, and she never got proper sexual education. Once again, slasher films saying we need sex-positive childhood.
Well, that's what Carrie is, you could say, propaganda for sex ed. The whole point of the movie is that this girl is completely stifled sexually.
And she says, I'm dying, and the other girls start throwing tampons on her like a stoning and saying... And she freaks out and screams. And then it turns out her fears are warranted because when she gets home, her mother starts saying, only whores have periods, basically.
Or no, that is the sin of every woman.
Yeah, exactly.
But there's more to that because right after her period scene, she's taken to the principal's office. And there's this great shot where the principal notices the bloodstains on the coach's shorts and is like creeped out by them. So it's like a lot of menstrual stigma of like the man is like terrified of menstrual stains.
And he keeps calling her Cassie.
Yeah.
We're all very concerned about you, Cassie. And she says, it's Carrie! And then as she says that, there's the noise, and we see the first signs that she has telekinesis.
Yeah, where the guy's ashtray flips.
We're all sorry about this incident, Cassie.
It's Carrie!
So Carrie, her stifled, repressed rage manifests as telekinesis.
Right, which is a power she gets as she comes of age, much like her sexual power that she gets as she comes of age.
Now, I really like the Brian De Palma film of Carrie. Harry doesn't like it as much.
I just watched it for surprisingly the first time this month.
This is a classic for me.
And I thought it was pretty hokey.
Our mom loves this movie.
Really?
And Sissy Spacek, it turns in a fantastic performance.
I think a lot of Brian De Palma movies are pretty hokey, though. I think that's kind of... It works with movies like Body Double and Dress to Kill, but with Carrie, I feel like it should be more serious, and it shouldn't have all the over-the-top dramatic musical cues and the outrageous cartoonish acting.
Well, Carrie, as we said, it's not a slasher film. It's, it's after Black Christmas, and it's important in lending to the teenage coming-of-age womanhood, power, violence trend, but it is not a slasher film. If anything, it's a massacre film. It's mostly a story, it's a teen drama, as you said, kind of like Hell High, which we talked about earlier. It's a coming-of-age. And what happens is simultaneously one girl who witnessed the scene in the locker room of Carrie being bullied feels bad and arranges for her boyfriend to ask Carrie to the prom as a goodwill gesture, simultaneously as some other kids who felt slighted by Carrie's bullying in the locker room getting them in trouble decide to plan an even bigger prank on Carrie at the prom and to dump pig's blood all over her.
Yeah, and it's... Stephen King kind of invented the idea of sociopathic high school bullies, which would carry on in most of his work and in a lot of just general 80s media.
He seems to have this constant trend of the psychopathic greasers.
Yeah.
Like in Stand By Me, in Sometimes They Come Back, in It with Henry Bowers.
But that would transcend out of Stephen King and become just a trend of the 80s, like in The Karate Kid and The Goonies and Footloose, where there are bullies who will literally murder their victims.
Yeah. I don't know if it was that bad in the 80s. Maybe it was. But the bullies in these movies are terrible. So it all comes to a head at prom night. Carrie has the best night of her life. The poor thing has had the worst life. And finally, her mother doesn't want her to go, but she uses her telekinesis.
That's the best part. She says, I'm going, mother. And she finally stands up to her mom and uses her newfound womanly powers to stand up to her mother and force her way out of the house.
If I concentrate hard enough, I can move things.
But tonight, no one will laugh at Carrie.
If you don't have a date to the prom next Friday, would you like to go with me?
She's with the best-looking boy in the senior class.
He's trying to trick me again.
She'll be voted queen of the prom.
You know, I can make sure that you don't hurt Carrie White anymore.
For Carrie, it will be a dream come true. For everyone else, it will be a nightmare.
She goes to prom. She dances with the most handsome boy there. She is elected prom queen, and in her moment of glory, she's doused with pig's blood, and they all laugh at her, just like her mother said.
They don't, though.
It's her delusion.
She has a delusion of them laughing at her. Like, 2 people are laughing at her, and a lot of people are genuinely horrified, but then she has this vision of everyone laughing at her.
And there's this repeated sound of her mother saying, "They're all going to laugh at you," as everyone laughs. Adam Sandler did a joke about that later, where a mother only repeats, "They're all going to laugh at you."
Oh, in The Water Boy?
No, in one of his terrible comedy albums. But I listened to it at summer camp. But the point is that Carrie then decides everyone's got to die. And she uses her telekinesis to murder the whole prom.
Which, that part was pretty gnarly. But I felt
really great use of split screen.
Good. I love the split screen. I thought this long slow motion, like there's like a 6-minute slow motion scene where Sue, the nice girl who's trying to help Carrie, notices the string and follows it all the way up to the bucket of blood and like sees everything and tries to stop it. And it's so long and all suspense is gone because of how dragged out it is.
And then when the girl pulls the string that makes the bucket of blood fall on Carrie, it's like an orgasm moment.
Yeah.
She moans in pleasure, and the actress even said, "I tried to make that look like an orgasm."
Yeah. Well, then the weird thing is, so Carrie kills everybody or most everybody,
and it's this orgasmic moment of death.
But Tommy gets killed by being hit by the bucket of blood.
I think that just knocks him out, and then he dies in the fire.
No, because Sue's holding him and saying like he's not breathing or something like that. Like, so Tommy was gonna die anyway. Like their prank was gonna just kill this guy.
Yeah, it was. I guess.
Yeah,
I guess that's to show how mean a prank it really was.
Yeah, it would have killed Tommy even if Carrie didn't have powers.
In the novel, Carrie destroys the entire town.
Or she like blows up the gas.
She blows up the gas stations and sets fire to the whole town.
Yeah.
And then the last moment is a young girl who's also demonstrating telekinetic abilities, as though this rage now passes on to a new generation.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. And then also when she gets home, there's this really heavy-handed imagery with Saint Sebastian. She has this Saint Sebastian figure in her the closet that her mom locks her in.
Right.
Which is the same that's pierced with arrows.
Her mom locks her in a closet with an image of Saint Sebastian, like the Trunchbull in Matilda.
Yeah, pierced with arrows. And then at the end, when her mom stabs her, she uses her telekinesis powers to skewer her mom with knives and pin her to the wall, and she becomes the image of Saint Sebastian. And it's like, that was I love that end scene with her mom, but then like, did the house have to literally sink into hell? Like, that's the whole thing that Stephen King does where it goes to the next level. Like, the Shining house eats itself at the end of the book.
Sure.
Or the house sinks to hell.
He's known for explosive endings, quite literally. A lot of his novels end with explosions, and it's because he's a gardener writer instead of an architect writer. He does not plot out the ending when he starts writing. He starts writing without knowing how it's going to end, and that's his style. But also, in the novel, Carrie does not kill her mother in the image of Saint Sebastian. In the novel, she says, "Mother, your heart is stopping," and she stops her heart with telekinesis.
Well, that wouldn't have translated as well to film.
Wouldn't have been very visual, very literary though. So Carrie really embodies what I said earlier, the Madonna theory, and I think Madonna theory is going to carry us through the rest of our slasher analysis, which is slashers are about girls coming of age into women, and as girls attain womanhood, they realize that the world wants to slash them, and they realize that they're incredibly powerful. Nothing distills those two concepts as well as Carrie does.
Yeah, and my whole thing about Carrie was, at the very last scene, Sue in a dream walks to the old house where Carrie and her mother used to live, and it's sunk into
film was shot in backwards and then turned backwards to look forwards, David Lynch style.
And there's a for sale sign, and written on the for sale sign is Carrie White burns in hell. And that made me realize that I don't want to see the movie that's about Carrie. I want to see the movie that takes place in the town where Carrie used to live, where the high school kids tell the story of creepy Carrie, who 10 years ago did this massacre at a prom. That's what a slasher is. It's, you tell stories of the urban legend that happened in the past, and then it comes back to haunt you.
That's a really good point. I also find that shot incredibly sad, because it's like, after all that Carrie suffered through, she's remembered as like, fuck you.
Well, they know,
burn in hell, Carrie.
They know that she killed everyone at prom. Well, they believe that she did it.
She did. Like, they know that her telekinesis made that happen, but I mean, didn't anyone reflect and say, we weren't very nice to her?
Well, she killed the people who were nice to her. She killed the coach, who was the only person who was nice to her. The whole point is that
she becomes a monster.
She's like, is that her adversity makes her a monster.
We create these villains, people. Yeah. Don't be mean to the weird girl.
But Carrie is the setup for, a Freddy or a Jason. Totally. Somebody who suffered a horrible tragedy in the past and now has come back. But we see the origin story instead of the aftermath.
Which is great, because Carrie is the hybrid of the final girl with the slasher villain. She's both. Mm-hmm. She is both the final girl and the slasher villain. And let's talk more practically and less theoretically now. The last shot of Carrie
is she walks up to the stones where the house used to sit, and she looks down, and Carrie's bloody hand pops out of the grave and grabs her by the leg.
Not Carrie. Her friend walks up to the house.
Yes, Sue walks up to the house, and Carrie's hand grabs her.
And it's this great surprise ending, because there's this slow, melodramatic, sad music playing, and she's going to just kind of like sadly
she lays flowers
leave flowers and contemplate the death of Carrie, this girl she tried to help, but who she ultimately couldn't save. and then the hand of Carrie reaches from the grave and seizes her, and the music turns to terrifying, and Sue wakes up from a nightmare.
Right.
And her mother holds her, but she's still freaking out.
Which is the same ending as Dress to Kill.
Exact same ending as Dress to Kill. And Tom Savini, in chapter 3, or in part 3, we will discuss, Tom Savini who's a special effects artist who defined slashers in the 80s, became so obsessed with the ending of Carrie, the jump scare as the hand pops out of the grave, that he recreated it for his film The Prowler, and most famously for the ending of Friday the 13th, in which that one jump scare created the 12-movie villain, Jason Voorhees. So the ending of Carrie is incredibly influential, and also I think it's important because it brought teenagers back on the scene.
It brought high school. It was about high school drama.
Right, and that's what slashers will be, very much about high school and very much about girls becoming women.
And very much about high school kids being up to no good. A big part of Carrie is that John Travolta and his girlfriend are like bad kids. They're drinking, they're going to parties, they're having sex, and that's a big part of the themes that we'll get in later slasher movies.
Also, it was Stephen King's first novel and his first film adaptation of one of his novels, and Stephen King is one of the most important figures in horror. So him entering the scene in 1974 proves that Black Christmas, Texas Chainsaw, Stephen King, 1974 was a very important year in horror history.
Yeah.
And, But continuing this Madonna theme 2 years later, or actually Carrie came out in 77, so for the novel 2 years later, for the film 1 year before.
Carrie came out in 76, the same year as Alice, Sweet Alice.
Oh, it was the same year? Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay, maybe it came out in 77 in different countries, but yeah, Alice, Sweet Alice.
Right, which is another great, pretty underrated slasher film.
Not well known.
Because it doesn't have the pure slasher structure, it's more like an American Giallo.
Yeah.
But it has all the themes. It's all about a girl coming of age, and a girl who's not very girly.
Yeah.
And she comes of age in this very Catholic society where, because she isn't girly like her sister, the people around her literally think she's a murderer.
So Alice, Sweet Alice, also known as Holy Terror, also known as Communion, a, by all accounts, slasher. We were arguing about this, whether it's a slasher or not, from 76.
I think it mostly is.
Stars one of our favorite actresses,
Paula Shepherd, who is in our opening soundtrack.
Right. You know the second sound, when you listen to the Cinematic Oblivion theme song.
She says, you kill me, bitch. That's the joke of all time.
That's from Liquid Sky. She was only in 2 films. This film we're talking about, Alice, Sweet Alice, and Liquid Sky, which we will definitely do an episode about later.
But she's our favorite actress.
We love her. She's our favorite #1 actress of all time, Paula Shepherd.
She's so good as Alice in Alice, Sweet Alice.
So good.
This poor girl who is neglected by the Catholic Church for not being a good girl.
Right.
She
not
likes
especially
bugs.
feminine. Yeah.
She likes weird stuff. She plays in an abandoned building. She doesn't have feminine qualities, and because of that, she's neglected by her family and by the church.
It feels very much like a Giallo, also because even though it's an American film, it's about Italian Americans.
It's about Catholic Italian Americans living in some like tenements.
Right. It's in Paterson, New Jersey. So this is like the New Jersey Sopranos. It's like the Sopranos, basically. You know, it's like this very insular Italian Catholic community. Whereas they have 2 daughters, Alice, who's kind of this like strange, morbid tomboy. And I forget the other girl's name.
Karen, who's the perfect little Christian.
Played by Brooke Shields.
Yeah.
Who would be famous for other controversial films of her time. And she is the, like, darling.
Right. Well, when we first meet the characters, the priest greets them at the door, and he kisses Karen, and he kisses the mother, and he says nothing to Alice.
Alice is ignored as the morbid weirdo. And then early on in the film, Karen is murdered.
Karen is murdered, and when she is murdered, the priest hears screams, and he skips giving Alice her first communion, which is important.
One of the alternative titles for this film, Communion, is actually the most thematically appropriate to what the film's about. Mm-hmm. The whole film is about Karen, the little darling, very feminine sister, is preparing for her first communion.
And everyone adores her. Every member of the church is so excited for her communion and her to become the girl that they want her to be.
And if you're thinking that's a little weird, you're right. After all, this is the Catholic Church. Yeah. Everyone's obsessed with Karen and her little...
her femininity.
Her adolescent femininity. Mm-hmm. Everyone's really obsessed with that. And to a fault, I would say. Mm-hmm. Whereas Alice, who's also very young, maybe like 14 or 15...
Even younger, like 12.
She has not had her communion. She desperately wants it. And remember, what we've been talking about this whole time, a girl turning into a woman, communion is the Catholic symbol for that, you know?
But anyway, Alice has not given her communion, which not only is her not being able to advance into her next stage of womanhood. It is also her not being forgiven for her sins.
Yes, of course. And so as Alice is about to receive her first communion, it is stalled, and they discover the body of her sister, who has been murdered and placed in a trunk lit in the back of the church.
Right, and everyone begins to suspect Alice in the killing because Alice is not ladylike.
Well, early on, we see Alice bully her sister pretty badly.
Well, yeah, Alice is a kid. She's an imperfect, kind of fucked up, awkward child. She's not a great kid, but she's also not a killer.
No.
And no one gives her the benefit of the doubt. Everybody immediately suspects her because she's not a good Catholic girl like the other girls in their community.
Exactly. And also Alice, early on in the film, she is wearing a raincoat and a creepy mask, and her sister stumbles upon her in an abandoned building, and Alice says, "I told you never to follow me. You get the hell out of here," and is just awful to her sister. And then later, when we see her sister, Karen Brooke Shields, be murdered, it's by someone also wearing a raincoat and a mask, the same mask. Mm-hmm. So we are, by all accounts, led to believe that it is Alice.
Right. Well, about 2/3 of the way through the movie, we find out that...
Hey, by the way, right now, you should pause. And if you've never seen Alice, Sweet Alice, it's free on Amazon if you have an Amazon Prime subscription. Go watch it, 1976, Alice, Sweet Alice, because we are about to spoil the ending.
Yeah, it's a really great movie.
Spoilers. If you don't want to hear spoilers about Alice, Sweet Alice, please skip to
1 hour, 36 minutes.
So now we are going to spoil who the killer is in Alice, Sweet Alice.
So about 2/3 through the film, we find out that the murderer is this old sister in the church who we've seen before, who's very critical of Alice and very doting on Karen. And it's this whole idea of the Catholic Church, the most faithful ones are turned into violence, and specifically women are turned violent against each other.
Right. This nun is the killer and has put on the guise of Alice to frame her for the murders, but also out of jealousy for her youth.
Yeah, she kills Karen because Karen is this pure virginal child of God, and she's envious of her holiness, essentially.
This is interesting because we don't usually get female killers in slasher films.
Except for the one big exception.
Right,
yeah.
Of course. But in this case, it is very much about how the Catholic Church pits women against each other in competition.
And it's like the movie is pretty much like exposing the element, like how this church community is abusive to women and how it drives them to act a certain way, and if they don't act a certain way, they are kind of ousted. Alice is a pariah in her society for not being, at age 12 or 13, not being a perfect girl.
You see a lot of gender policing in this film. They're constantly being like, be a lady, be ladylike, you know, stop being so much like a tomboy.
The busybody aunt who is always on Alice's case about her behavior.
And the busybody aunt is always giving Alice's mother a bunch of shit. And in that case, we also see gender policing within the women community. So women police each other. And the Catholic Church learned long ago that if you can get women to keep each other down, you don't even have to try.
Right. Which is the ultimate metaphor with the nun murdering the children.
So if you're starting to figure it out, a lot of these films we're talking about in Chapter 2, Carrie, Alice, Sweet Alice, Black Christmas, they're very feminist films. If you get down to the root of what they're really about, you know?
Right, which is why we said in part 1 that slashers are some of the more progressive films that we'll see. They get cartoonish later on, but their inherent themes are very ahead of their time as far as sexual awareness.
There's one other important thing to note, which is that Alice, just as we said, she starts to have the realization that she is a victim of slashing at the same time as she realizes her own power through the figures of the priest, her father, but mostly the weird fat child molester that lives in her building.
Right, Mr. Alfonso.
Right. So Mr. Alfonso is their creepy neighbor who often touches
Alice.
Who often touches Alice in inappropriate ways and often makes...
talks a lot about how beautiful Karen was.
Yeah, talks about how sexy her dead sister was and how Alice should have
been Alice. Yeah, like, too bad the pretty ones always go.
Yeah, too bad your little sister died instead of you. And he's just an awful person. And she pranks him in a very, tomboyish way, which is she leaves cockroaches
on... a jar of cockroaches on his sleeping chest.
She also constantly calls him fatty and tells him he's disgusting.
Yeah.
At one point, he really does kind of come at her.
He grabs her and she, threatens to kill his cat.
Yeah, he corners her and touches her and says, I will, do this and no one will believe you, you know? And then she grabs his cat, which in a scene of very clear animal abuse that was actually filmed, she grabs the cat and is like, I'll kill your cat, and he lets her go. Later, he's murdered by the nun, and Alice is clearly framed for the murder. But in the last scene...
Well, the last scene is another communion, and the police have discovered that it's this woman, Miss Tredoni, who is the nun, and so the priest says he'll get her to come along quietly. So it's communion, and it's finally time for Alice to take her communion. And Miss Tredoni lines up next to Alice, and the communion plate is going around, and Alice is skipped over, and the priest goes to confront Mrs. Tredoni, and Alice, with her tongue out, still fails to receive her communion.
She's not allowed to grow up.
She's not allowed to grow up, and she's not allowed to be forgiven. So the priest confronts Miss Tredoni, who does not respond well, and stabs him in the neck.
Murders him in front of the entire mass.
In front of the entire congregation. And Alice picks up her bag and walks away as the police rush in and handles the murder weapon, the knife that she has taken with her, implying that due to all of her adversity and her repression, she has now become the murderous woman that haunted her family.
Once again, like in Black Christmas, where we create the parallel between the first murdered girl, Claire, the professional virgin, and the house mother, the professional virgin, we create a parallel between the bitter old nun who has committed these murders out of vanity and envy of youth in Alice, who has been rejected by her Catholic community and will likely grow up to be an equally maladapted nun one day, right? And so we see the woman being forced to reject her strength and embrace this maladapted anima.
And instead of growing up as the well-balanced person she could have been, she has also become another killer in this cycle of abuse.
And so we have these three films, Black Christmas, Carrie, and Alice, Sweet Alice, respectively released in 74, 76, and 77, which...
No, both 76. 74, 76, 76.
Which represent the Madonna figure very, very distinctly. And the Madonna figure, in opposition, nemesis, to the slasher villain, will become the defining figure of the slasher genre. I honestly think the final girl is more important than the slasher villain in the distinction of the slasher genre.
In the distinction of the film itself, but not in what will go down in culture.
Sure, because people miss the point.
Yeah.
So let's move to Chapter 3, where a new breed of violence takes hold.
Now we'll move back into some more of our folklore origins as we go into Chapter 3, Sawney Bean.
They wanted to see something different, but something different saw them first. The hills have eyes.
Mister, don't take your family back in that area. The silver has been gone for 40 years now. Besides, there's nothing back in there but animals.
I come back for you later, girlie.
Why are you doing this?
The story of an American family who lost everything except the will to survive. Murdered, raped, burned, but not beaten. The hills have eyes. The story of one family's refusal to die.
I'm gonna get those animals.
The hills have eyes.
So Wes Craven, as all of this is going on, we haven't even mentioned him yet. Wes Craven, one of our favorites, has begun his career, and in 1977 releases his second important film, The Hills Have Eyes. Previously,
he made Last House on the Left from 1972, which you should all know, and if you don't know, it's a suburban set rape revenge film that is notable for being one of the most brutal films to be released at the time.
Wes Craven died about 2 years ago, and there was a really great... this is the second time I'm mentioning a Terry Gross Fresh Air interview. I really love her interview style. Terry Gross's interview with Wes Craven, she said to him something that I think everyone who's seen Last House on the Left thought. She said to Wes Craven that when she went to the theaters in the 70s and 72 to see Last House on the Left, she was incredibly upset by its graphic depiction of rape, sexual violence, and assault. And it has a very Texas Chainsaw Cinema Verite style. She said she was so upset she actually walked out of the theater.
Yes.
And she said, Mr. Craven, why did you choose to depict such horrific sexual violence? And in Hills Have Eyes, he depicts, equivalently upsetting sexual violence.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, I think, and I love this response, he said, when I was a kid, I killed a rat just to see what it would be like. And it was one of the most upsetting experiences of my life. I thought it would just die. I shot it with a BB gun or a slingshot. I can't remember what he said, but you can go listen to the Terry Gross interview with Wes Craven. He said, it took so long to die, and I remember it clinging to life and fighting back And I remember I never ever wanted to kill anything ever again. And he said he realized that the way violence had been depicted in every film he'd ever seen was completely wrong. Violence is not like, shoot them up, they all die, it's very action hero exciting. It's not like that at all. Violence is horrific and disgusting, and there's nothing pretty about it. And the way that Giallo films or Gialli depict violence in the way that some slasher films depict violence as very sexy and beautiful, it's not at all the kind of style that Wes Craven wanted to go for. Darren Aronofsky agrees with him on this point, that if you want to depict violence, you have a responsibility as an artist to depict violence as disgusting and uncomfortable and awful. And Hills Have Eyes really does that.
Right. And it brings that tone into this era of horror films. The unfortunate thing is that that's the same thing that Texas Chainsaw does in a very effective way. Slashers would kind of forego this.
Yeah, they will, but that's okay because slashers are more like image symbol plays.
Slashers are a lot lighter.
However, in Chapter 3, we will be discussing a very important Wes Craven slasher, which had a huge influence on my affinity for slashers.
Mm-hmm.
And yours as well, I'm sure. Hills Have Eyes is basically about a family who's traveling through the desert. And it's got a lot of slasher elements.
But it's also got a lot of Hicksploitation elements.
Yes,
and
it's back to Deliverance.
It's very much this, we run into this backwoods Sawney Bean family out in the wild, and this is their lifestyle. Their lifestyle is slasher murder. They're not maniacs. They're not insane. This is just the way they live.
I didn't explain yet. Sawney Bean. Going back in episode 1 when we were talking about folklore and Greek theater, it's a Scottish legend, much like what we were talking about with Texas Chainsaw. The Bloody Benders, H.H. Holmes, Ed Gein.
And the time, so legend says, of a savage whose stark crimes are echoed in the nightmares of our culture to this very day.
This is the legend and the history of the cannibal Sawney Bean.
So the legend of Sawney Bean, a Scottish folktale, is that there is a family led by the patriarch Sawney Bean who live in a cave which is covered at high tide by waters, and you can't get in because the front of the cave is flooded. The back is not; it's dry. But at low tide you can get in, and Sawney Bean at low tide will send his beautiful daughters out to lure travelers into his cave, where the family will eat them. This is a real Texas Chainsaw family, a real Bloody Benders type of family from Scottish folklore. It's unclear if they were a real true crime family or if they're just a folktale. However, they've inspired a lot of media. They inspired this film from 1977, Wes Craven's The Hills Have Eyes. They also inspired one of our favorite shared horror novels from only 3 years later, 1980, the same year as a lot of slashers start to crop up. Off Season by Jack Ketchum.
Off Season is kind of like, it's basically The Hills Have Eyes set in New England as opposed to the desert. And it has the same elements of a family of rogue cannibals, and it has the overly upsetting, joyless violence.
I had the privilege to speak with Jack Ketchum about Off Season and to ask him what he thought made violence so effective in that novel. And he said to me, characters. He said, this was at the World Horror Convention in Portland, characters, and Wes Craven knew this as well, make violence effective. If you care, if you have an investment in the characters, the violence feels more real.
And the violence in Off Season is some of the most brutal violence I've ever seen or read or experienced in any regard.
If you want fast-paced, brutal horror literature, go read Off Season by Jack Ketchum. As Stephen King said, if you read Off Season at Thanksgiving, you probably won't sleep well till Christmas, or something like that. I'm paraphrasing. Stephen King said something like that. Stephen King, man, he's a champ. He started to become famous in 1974, and he immediately started to champion other good horror writers. I mean, he really looks out for the family on that account. Jack Ketchum's Off Season is a fantastic horror novel. Go read it. Basically, 3 years before that novel was published, Wes Craven did the equivalent story with The Hills Have Eyes. So, The Hills Have Eyes is about a family traveling through the desert. A gas station attendant, much like Texas Chainsaw, says, you don't want to go that way. Go a different way. But they say, nah, it's a shortcut. We're going that way. The father is a horrible racist who used to live in New York, and he wants a break from it all. He talks about the N-words who always bother him back in his old neighborhood. He talks about
the 70s.
Yeah, he talks about the hillbillies who throw stuff off roofs. He's this bitter, evil old patriarch, and he's got his whole family with him.
He's also he's a retired cop.
Right, he's a retired cop.
That's an important point.
And it's this common theme that actually keeps cropping up in horror movies in the 70s and 80s, which is like, let's leave the city to be safe, and then they find the same evil, even worse evil in rural or suburban areas.
Yeah.
You know? So they're traveling through the desert.
And their car breaks down in the middle of nowhere, and at night the father goes off to get gas, and he comes back and is set on fire.
Well, the basic gist is this film even contains a deeper philosophical message, which is the fact that this area where they're traveling through used to be a nuclear testing site, and all the people who lived in this area were told to evacuate, and some refused to evacuate.
Right, and they're kind of the throwaways of society living on the fringe of culture as we got from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. But in this regard, their transgressions are because they are the product of experimentation.
Exactly. And so these people...
Well, not experimentation, but radiation and side effects and stuff.
Right. And these people are now mutated and cannibalistic. And they are victims of a society that they feel has rejected them. And so they feel justified in preying sexually and cannibalistically on anyone who happens to fall prey to their traps, basically. So they assault this family. They rape and murder the mother and the daughter, right?
Yeah, they kill all the women except for the youngest daughter.
Right, and they kidnap the infant baby.
And it becomes a rape revenge. Well, not because rape.
Kind of, yeah.
It's a revenge movie mostly. It's a survival revenge movie. It's like Deliverance times 10. It's like
Yes.
Deliverance with more violence and more revenge.
And a supernatural angle in the mutant, the nuclear mutant.
But they don't show a lot of signs of mutation. They got the guy with the deformed head to play the main mutant.
The famous actor,
Yeah, whose name I don't remember. But
I'll put him in the show notes.
But mostly it's just a cannibal cult. It's not like the remake, where the remake, which we both like.
We love it. We don't like most horror remakes,
Yeah.
but the Alexander Aja remake of Hills of Ice is actually quite
really
good.
because he added to the mythology and did the whole thing with the town of the mutants. But in his version, they really are heavily mutated. They're monsters. And in this, they're very much people. They're just like cave people.
Right. In the remake, they can't even speak.
Yeah,
and
some of them are like melted.
Right. In this one, they're more just like, cave people. And this kind of goes back to like Cormac McCarthy's, Child of God, where it's like someone who just moves into a cave because they want to be a little separate from society.
And you become an animal.
Right,
You're
right.
like, you behave the behavior of an animal, which is, when humans encounter that, they see it as psychotic mania.
However, I think that what Wes Craven really brings is, while slashers will downplay this serious violence, they still are a little bit more, in my opinion, a little bit more upsetting than Gialli. They are a little bit more uncomfortable, not as sexy, not as exploitative, and a little bit more about how violence is horrible. And there's no way you can watch this
Sometimes.
film. Right. What Hills Have Eyes, in the major assault scene where the mutants attack the trailer, rape, murder the women, kidnap the baby, there's no way anyone can find any beauty in that scene.
Right.
It's disgusting and ugly.
But that is true for the first wave of slashers, but by the time you get into, Nightmare on Elm Street 4 and 5, it becomes the violence is a big joke.
Sure, and you know what? We're only going to do 3 parts of this slasher history now, but I've already said that in the future, down the road, we should do a whole episode about slasher sequels, because that's a whole different breed.
I'm not interested.
We're going to do it.
I don't want to watch all 14 boring Jason movies.
So, Hills Have Eyes ends with the young man whose wife has been killed, the son-in-law of the family, seeking revenge, killing a few of the mutants, and recapturing his baby.
Yeah, and it ends with this great shot where he's smashing the main mutant's head, and it just freeze frames on him holding a rock, smashing his head, and the credits roll.
Yes.
Another abrupt 70s ending.
The Hills Have Eyes, the most shocking, terrifying film you will ever see, by Wes Craven, writer and director of The Last House on the Left. The Hills Have Eyes. The lucky ones died first.
So Chapter 3 is not going to be that long, but I do just want to shuffle through a couple other important films that came out in 77 and that it continued to have significance in 77.
Well, we know Suspiria came out in 77.
Right.
Which is not totally a giallo. It's more supernatural mystery.
So this is over in Italy now. This is simultaneously as Hills Have Eyes came out. Dario Argento is still doing his thing over in Italy.
Yeah. And Suspiria, the thing that separates it from the movies that came before it is that it has the most brutal murders of any giallo that had ever been made.
And very good music that foreshadows the music of 78.
Yeah, it really gets at that great goblin score and that really excessive violent, over-the-top murders of beautiful women, which we'd seen with other giallos, but this one was definitely the one that had gotten the most viewings in America.
Sure. So Suspiria was a Dario Argento film about an American girl who goes to an Italian beauty fashion school.
Ballet school, I thought.
Oh, yeah, it was ballet. You're right. I'm sorry. Yeah, I was thinking of Blood and Black Lace. She goes to a ballet school where the girls are being murdered one by one, and it turns out a coven of witches is behind it. It's famous for its Goblin soundtrack. We're big Goblin fans over here at Cinematic
I'm
Oblivion.
wearing a Goblin pin right now.
Hey, and our theme song is a Goblin song.
Yeah, from Deep Red.
Yeah,
which we should also talk about.
Yes. So also, so I'm just gonna rattle off some 77, some films from 75 through 77 that had influence. Jaws. We're not going to do a whole podcast on Jaws. That's a whole different thing. But Jaws was about a shark killing people one by one, sort of a slasher, and also the first major blockbuster film. Deep Red, Profondo Rosso.
Right, which is the giallo that's closest to the slashers, I think, because it has the inciting childhood trauma at the center of it, and it has more of a one-by-one structure, even though it is focused on the mystery and the investigation.
And then just rattling them off, Burnt Offerings, The Killer Inside Me, which is a fantastic Jim Thompson novel. I recommend you read The Killer Inside Me if you want pulp violent literature. Made apparently into a film in 77, which I have not seen, and also remade by Michael Winterbottom later on with Casey Affleck, which I do like that film. The Little Girl Who Lives Down the Lane with Jodie Foster, who was a killer child in that film, much like Alice Sweet Alice.
Yeah, Who Can Kill a Child, which I want to do a whole movie about that guy.
A whole episode?
I mean, a whole episode about the guy who directed that. He also made a movie... He made a couple like pretty important Spanish films in the 70s that I think we should watch.
Well, let's do it. That'll be a later episode. The Town That Dreaded Sundown, which we hated.
It's rare that we don't finish a movie. We're pretty good about finishing movies.
Oh, even bad movies.
The Town That Dreaded Sundown was like the most unengaging film I've ever tried to watch.
Yeah, The Town That Dreaded Sundown is often cited as a proto-slasher, but it has no cinematic engagement.
It has... If you know what coverage is in filmmaking, that's a movie that has zero coverage, and it becomes so hard to get inside of.
Yes, exactly. Significantly, I want to also note that back in 71, a film was released, which you all know, Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, which actually continued to be distributed through 77 and became an American classic. You know Willy Wonka. Willy Wonka was an And Then There Were None killer. He was having kids knocked off one by one till he only had one final girl left, and his final girl was
Charlie Bucket.
And you know what? Willy Wonka has all the humor and all the panache of a Freddy Krueger, who we'll see later on. I think Willy Wonka is one of our first slasher villains.
Yeah. Well, while Nick is being too cool for the room, we should mention briefly that Hitchcock made his last film in 76, a movie called Family Plot. It was like a murder comedy.
Right. Well, I haven't seen it. Neither of us have seen it. We did see his second to last, his penultimate film, Frenzy.
Which is definitely from 1972, which is a murder mystery, serial killer mystery. And it definitely has more graphic violence and sexuality and sexual violence than any other Hitchcock movies. There's a graphic rape and murder scene in that movie.
Yeah, it feels like Peeping Tom or something.
And it's very clearly Hitchcock adapting to the more graphic 70s.
Right before his career ended entirely.
But in 77, Mel Brooks made High Anxiety.
Yeah, High Anxiety. For those of you who are Mel Brooks fans, Blazing Saddles, Young Frankenstein, you know that Mel Brooks is all about satire, parody, farce. He's all about the silly parodies of genres. So High Anxiety is Mel Brooks' very over-the-top parody film of Hitchcock films.
Right, and as Nick defined earlier, that whenever a genre becomes parodied, that's the signal culturally that we're sick of it. Not that we're sick of it, but that we understand it well enough that you can't keep giving it to us. You need to give us something new.
Exactly. So Mel Brooks making High Anxiety, which is a great comedy, and it's not like a mockery of Hitchcock films. It's a celebration of them. It's an homage to them. But High Anxiety signals the distinct end of the Hitchcock era and the need for a new breed of suspense. And this breed has been building from films that we talked about in Chapter 2. So we're going to move now. Oh, and briefly I want to mention that a Japanese film that we love dearly, Hausu, came out in 77, which is an old dark house film with slasher elements.
Yeah, which we had the privilege of seeing on film last month at the Roxy Theater.
That film deserves its own episode. Yeah. So we'll just move on to Chapter 4, Haddonfield.
I met him 15 years ago. I was told there was nothing left. No reason, no conscience, no understanding, and even the most rudimentary sense of life or death, of good or evil, right or wrong. 6-year-old child with this blank, pale, emotionless face and the blackest eyes, the devil's eyes. I spent 8 years trying to reach him, and then another 7 trying to keep him locked up because I realized that what was living behind that boy's eyes was purely and simply evil.
What do we do?
He's been here once tonight. I think he'll come back.
So, John Carpenter made his film debut in 1974 with a sci-fi movie called Dark Star that he made with Dan O'Bannon, who would later go on to write Alien. And he was very much established himself as a genre director because he started off with a sci-fi movie in 1974. Then 1976, he made Assault on Precinct 13, which was an action shoot-'em-up originally intended to be a Western. So he was just like dabbling in different genres. But in 1978, he came out strong with 3 movies that were touching into the horror genre. The first one being The Eyes of Laura Mars, which he wrote and was directed by Irvin Kershner. And it was very much a imitation of a giallo, but it was an attempt to merge giallo films with 1970s American crime movies like The French Connection and Serpico and Dog Day Afternoon. So it has a black trench coat killer and a murder mystery in it, but it also has a lot of the procedural elements of American crime movies. We found it to be somewhat undone by all the plotting that is much like most Italian giallos are undone.
Yeah, I think The Eyes of Laura Mars is... What's interesting is, as Harry said, the giallo hovered on the border between crime film and, like, dark teenage drama slasher film, you know? Mm-hmm. And it seems like The Eyes of Laura Mars was much more of an attempt to make it like, oh, the new American giallo will be crime films,
right,
like action films. Not at all. No one wants that. Slashers are the better interpretation of what giallos translate into an American culture. Eyes of Laura Mars is basically about Faye Dunaway as a model who takes...
She's a photographer.
A photographer, right. I'm sorry. She's a photographer who takes very morbid photographs of women in, like, grotesque or dead positions, like murder scenes, which is what a lot of modern advertisement looks like, you know? And it turns out she's not trying to depict violence. She's actually predicting violence because she is psychic, and she's predicting this series of murders that go on in the city she lives in. It's not a very good film.
No,
but you see the promise.
Really obvious. I predicted about 4 things that I didn't want to happen in the movie that then happened.
Harry was like, if this happens, I'm done with this movie. And then each thing he predicted happened.
Yeah, it was definitely a misstep, but it was a noble attempt.
It was a noble attempt. You can go check out The Eyes of Laura Mars if you want. We're not going to spoil it, but it'll be in the show notes. But it's not great.
Sure. So that same year, John Carpenter made a TV movie called Someone's Watching Me.
Right, and that didn't come out until November, after Halloween had already come out, but it was of a similar vein. However, there is another TV movie that came out in 1978, the month before Halloween. So in September of 1978, Are You in the House Alone came out. This is a very appropriate film to the Madonna theory that we discussed earlier. This is not a slasher film, it's a TV movie, and by all accounts, it is an after-school special in the traditional sense of the term. It is about sexual harassment and rape. It is actually very similar to the contemporary equivalent, like 13 Reasons Why. It's very similar to that. It's about a very innocent and sweet and smart young woman who is, standing between girlhood and womanhood, just like all the other films we've talked about, who is being sexually harassed and stalked by an anonymous person who is leaving these awful notes in her locker, who is making obscene phone calls, much like Black Christmas. And instead of having a mystery element and a slasher element, this film becomes an issue film. It is like a TV movie after school special. She's raped by a close friend, and then when she reports it, she isn't believed or taken seriously because the close friend is a rich and important member of the community, like Brock Turner.
And it's a very literal version of the underlying themes in a lot of these slasher movies. It's the literal version of the subtext of Black Christmas.
Right, and so slasher films will take these same subtexts and make them into symbol image plays, which is what makes slashers a little bit more compelling and interesting. This film is so on the nose. It's about how she then sets up a sting operation, much like in a later film, Dressed to Kill, to catch her rapist. And she does eventually, but he doesn't really go to jail or anything. He kind of just gets transferred out of the county, goes to a boarding school because he's from a wealthy family. It's a very Brock Turner equivalent story. And then at the end, very on the nose,
The last line is, "The system is wrong."
Cut to credits. She says it voiceover. I mean, this is a social issue film, much like a Lifetime original movie. It has creepy music. It has creepy phone calls. It has a very compelling and arresting lead actress who plays this poor young woman on the verge of womanhood who is victimized and then blamed for her victimization. There are plenty of scenes of her kind of calling into question issues we're still addressing nowadays in feminism, which is victim blaming. And there's a scene where she, when they're discussing why it's hard to prove her rape case, they say, well, she's not a virgin, is she?
Yeah.
As though it's her fault. Once again, proving that the final girl is not always just like this virginal figure, but she is a Madonna figure.
Yeah.
Phil sent me those notes, and Phil raped me, and you know it. Phil was right. You're out of your mind. He's got tramps and angels. You're the angel, and everybody else is a tramp. Phil said you threw yourself at him. Well, now I know it's true. Philip lover raped me. Allison, why would I make something like that up? Because you're crazy!
So the very next month, in October, we get John Carpenter's Halloween. He finally takes the full step into the horror genre and produces what is probably the finest slasher horror movie of the 70s.
This is the film that puts slashers on the map.
This defines them as a real genre that is important to American culture.
If you ask the layman who knows just like your basic facts about slashers, hey, what's the first slasher movie? They'll say Halloween.
Right, which we already established that Black Christmas is actually the first slasher, but Halloween is the first popular hit slasher.
Right, it's the slasher that inspires 1,000 iterations further and 1,000 remixes and remakes and ripoffs and retreads and clones, as it were. In fact, several other films of the 80s are called Halloween clones. That becomes a genre in and of itself. Harkening back to Black Christmas, when Black Christmas was, a cult success, Bob Clark, the producer, said...
Director.
Was he the director? Said, what would a Black Christmas sequel look like? John Carpenter took that directly to heart. While our stalker in Black Christmas left his backstory veiled in secret, and we could only assume through his freaky phone calls that he killed his little sister, in Halloween, it is made explicit.
Yeah, and we actually have a name for our killer. It's essentially if the killer in Black Christmas was given a backstory, and to a degree given a bit of a supernatural element.
Yes, that's right. We open Halloween in 1963, the year that Kennedy was assassinated. Harry, didn't you have a whole
I
Kennedy?
said that as a joke.
But this film's about the assassination of John F. Kennedy,
Yeah,
right?
no, it's about the death of the American dream, which coincided with the death of Kennedy and the beginning of the fall of American middle class.
That's definitely what it is.
And that's what Halloween's all about.
That's what it's all about. So Michael Myers commits his... In the opening scene, we see from a POV shot as a young woman, Judith Myers, has an early adolescent sexual encounter. This sexual encounter is immediately followed by her being murdered. And then there is the reveal that the person who has murdered her, we didn't see who it was.
It's all been through POV.
POV shots.
A trope that was established earlier with Black Christmas. And we see that it is her younger brother, Michael, wearing a Halloween mask, who's just murdered her.
So she's been murdered by her younger brother. And as he first sees his older sister naked, there's this noise. And that noise symbolizes that his sexual response is somehow arrested and maladapted.
That's the sound of the sexuality that he's seeing triggering his psychosis.
Once again, back to our Norman Bates, back to our Leatherface, back to our Ed Gein.
Yeah. The male psychotic being triggered by female sexuality is the running theme of this whole episode, I would say.
So, Michael, a 9-year-old boy, has just murdered his older sister directly following her early adolescent sexual encounter. Cut to 15 years later. And we're back in the town of Haddonfield. Keep in mind that Are You in the House Alone, the TV movie I mentioned earlier, takes place in Oldenfield. And a month later, this important slasher film takes place in Haddonfield, a small town in Illinois. It's autumn, and Laurie Strode, a local girl, is about to spend her Halloween babysitting the local boy, Tommy.
Coming over tonight? Same time, same place. Can we make jack-o'-lanterns? Sure. watch the monster movies? Sure. Be a read to me? Can we make popcorn? Sure.
She also likes to hang out with her friends. And in this town, Michael Myers, who had committed a murder 15 years before, has just escaped from the local insane asylum.
Before we go any farther, I want to talk about Haddonfield as a setting real quick. So one of the big differences between Giallos and Laura Mars is that Black Christmas and Halloween take the horror into the suburbs, which really separates it from both of those other genres, the American crime film and the Giallo, which are both urban set films. Halloween does not take place in the woods yet. It takes place in the suburbs, which is not only, middle class kind of white and wealthy, it also represents Americana, which you talked about earlier, which is another big defining factor of slashers. Slashers are very American, and I don't mean to say that they have American characters and take place in America. I mean that they are about American values and take place in American settings.
Exactly, and Halloween is very directly a reference to the kind of America we see as early as Washington Irving with The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, and as, middle 20th century as Norman Rockwell with his depictions of American society. Stephen King knows to build on these elements in Carrie and later in It and in Stand By Me and in many of his works, and Halloween is very much about this Norman Rockwell suburban America being invaded by the embodiment of evil.
Right, and we talked earlier about how urban legends were the folklore of the American landscape. Well, Halloween takes that to the next level by having it this Americana setting where the urban legend comes true. And that's the first time that this has happened in slasher films, that the urban legend is the truth of the situation.
In this case, the urban legend is the boogeyman.
Yeah.
And it's directly referenced as the boogeyman over and over again. In this small town of Haddonfield, this 9-year-old boy, Michael Myers, committed this murder of his older sister in 1963. 15 years later, Dr. Loomis, the psychologist who has worked with him most closely, goes to the insane asylum where he's kept to pick him up, and he escapes and steals their car.
Which we saw earlier, the exact same thing, the escaping and the stealing of the car in Silent Night, Bloody Night from 1973.
Yeah, exactly. So recurring that. And Dr. Loomis immediately alerts the local authorities. He's definitely headed back to Haddonfield. And so we cut to Haddonfield. What's going on there? Beautiful small town America.
Yeah.
Teenage girls babysitting, having boyfriends, cheerleading. We're from Haddonfield. Couldn't be prouder. Don't hear us now. We'll say a little louder. It's Americana to a T. And Michael Myers arrives wearing this warped and weird Captain Kirk mask.
Which, of course, is the ironic juxtaposition of a child's Halloween mask as worn by this adult killer. Both creepy in its uncanniness, but also symbolizing that Michael Myers is still a child inside.
So when Michael comes to Haddonfield, when he comes to town, he starts stalking immediately Laurie. And spoiler alert, go watch Halloween. Go watch Halloween 2. Spoiler alert. Star Wars style, Michael Myers is Laurie Strode's brother. It turns out Laurie is his sister. That's revealed in Halloween 2. And she was adopted by another family to forget about the trauma of the Myers family. We don't discover that till later. But he starts stalking Laurie, and then we can tell he's stalking Laurie in the same way he stalked his other sister, Judith, because he's got this weird problem with girls coming of age. However, later on in the movie, we see Tommy, who's the younger boy that Laurie babysits.
Yeah, and Tommy, we're introduced to him getting bullied at school, and these kids come and surround him after school, and he's holding a pumpkin, and they say, "The boogeyman's gonna get you, Tommy, the boogeyman's gonna get you on Halloween night," and he drops his pumpkin and it smashes, and he walks out of school all sad, and Michael starts following him. And we were thinking that Michael follows Laurie and the other girls and watches them with this lustfulness. But when he's following Tommy, because he doesn't kill children, that's kind of established, he just kills teenagers, that he's kind of seeing himself in Tommy as this sad, scared child. Because the real key to Michael Myers and a lot of these slasher villains is that they are arrested development and they are stuck as the children that they were when these traumatic events happened to them.
In the sense that Michael Myers probably sees Laurie Strode, his sister, as the Madonna, and sees the other two girls she hangs out with as the whore, and the angels tramps, as they say in Are You in the House Alone. But he sees Tommy as him. He's a child. He never got to grow up. At 9, he was put in an insane asylum, and he's never progressed from then. So that's who he is. Later on, he'll see a grown man, and he'll see him in a completely different light. I'm going to cut ahead in the movie. Later in the film, Michael in very giallo format, surprises a couple, a teenage boy and girl, two of Laurie's friends, having sex. When the boy goes downstairs to get them beers to bring back upstairs, he discovers Michael in the closet, and Michael pins him to the wall. He lifts him up by the neck and pins him to the wall with a kitchen knife. Now, this reminded me of a butterfly being pinned, like Leodopterians will pin butterflies to exarium.
You know the term for a butterfly?
Well, Vladimir Nabokov was a famous Leodopterian.
Leodopterian?
Yeah, and he would pin butterflies so that he could study them. And this is Michael pinning the butterfly. And what is the butterfly? It's the advanced larval stage.
Well, the other thing is he studies the corpse that he's pinned to the wall, and he looks
turns
at
his head. It's this very contemplative scene.
Because he doesn't see himself in this grown man.
Exactly that. No, so he sees himself in Tommy. He stalks him in his car with empathy.
Mm-hmm.
But then when he pins this teenage boy who's sexually active, who's sexually mature. Yeah, when he pins this sexually mature,
no way to relate to this creature.
Exactly, he stares at him so contemplatively, like a pinned butterfly. Pin and mount me like a butterfly, said Morrissey. It's this like through puberty symbol. The caterpillar into the butterfly is this symbol.
But also, and this is a side note, this is where Halloween takes the slasher killer into the supernatural level, where Michael's able to pick a grown man up by his neck with one arm.
And Michael's lived in like one room since he was 9 years old.
Yeah.
How is he this strong?
Right, and how is he this invincible?
Right.
This is where Black Christmas is the first slasher, but it has a lot of plot. It's a lot about them talking to the police, the character relations, the police tapping the phones. Halloween simplifies this into a stalk and chase movie.
Yes.
The movie is about a character being maneuver and hide and outsmart their stalker. And that is what I said earlier, where it's the last act of a Hitchcock film. It's the last 10 minutes of Rear Window. It is just the chase and the escape.
I said this in part one. The defining quality of a final girl is precociousness, and Laurie Strode is excessively precocious.
You guys think I'm too smart.
I don't. I think you're wacko. Now you're seeing men behind bushes.
Remember, Laurie is our final girl. She's Michael's sister. She's the one who is often regarded as the Madonna figure in this film. She's a babysitter. On the same night as two of her friends are off having sex with their boyfriends, she's babysitting 2 kids. She even gets saddled with one of the kids from the other girl. And she is this incredibly maternal, strong figure. And when her friends start to disappear, she doesn't just give in. She immediately starts to investigate.
Yeah, so then the movie becomes the stalk and chase film that it's been. And this is where we get the element that we saw with and All Through the House from Tales from the Crypt, and the last half of Texas Chainsaw.
Yes.
The final girl escaping the killer. And it's done all in the shadows. It's interiors, it's dark interiors, hiding in shadows, creeping. And that's goes all the way back to The Bat and other movies we saw in the silent era, finally being taken to its penultimate experience.
I think the important distinguishing factor here is that the final girl fights hard, like Texas Chainsaw. Maybe we didn't talk about this enough, but Texas Chainsaw was the film that established a female survivor fighting incredibly tooth and nail against her male aggressors.
Yeah.
And we see that again in Halloween.
And in Halloween, it's taken to the next level where he can't be killed.
He can't be killed, and as she says, in a very poignant moment where she's talking to the 2 children she's babysitting, and by the way, the 2 children she's babysitting are both young kids, maybe 8 or 9 years old, a boy and a girl, who are also kind of formatively adolescent. Even though they're like pre-sexual, they are both like a boy and a girl who are kind of like learning to be together. The boy tries to scare the girl at certain points, but they also have this camaraderie. So they're kind of a microcosm for this male-female dynamic. And Laurie says to them,
There's nothing to be scared of.
Are you sure? How?
I killed him.
You can't kill the boogeyman.
Get in there, come on, Tommy. Now lock the door.
and then he's right. The boogeyman appears right behind her.
Because this is a living urban legend come into old school Americana.
The living metaphor. You can't kill the world of men, as you said before. And as the film ends,
the beautiful empty shots that we saw earlier in Black Christmas, where she looks out and she says, "Was that the boogeyman?" And Dr. Loomis says, "I believe it was." And we see that Michael's corpse has gone.
She says, "It was the boogeyman." And he says, "As a matter of fact, it was."
Yeah.
And
she looks out and the corpse is gone because it stood up and walked away. And we see these beautiful shots of the empty streets of Haddonfield late on Halloween night. and we hear Laurie's theme begin to play.
As Michael's breathing intensifies. And it's almost this idea that you can't kill him. Dr. Loomis shoots him 6 times in the chest. And he will pervade every place you go, everywhere you are. You will never be free of him. His breathing is in the depths of your eardrums as you explore every avenue of suburbia. You'll never be free of him. And they won't make a sequel to this film for another 3 years. But when they do, it continues right where the original left off, like literally a minute later.
Black cats and goblins and broomsticks and ghosts, covens of witches with all their hosts. You may think they scare me, you're probably right. Black cats and goblins on Halloween night. Trick or treat!
So that is the end of 1978 in October. And Americans have officially been introduced to the slasher film.
From here on out, everyone with a pulse will try to profit on this, and slashers will profligate throughout the American film industry.
And become easily the dominant genre of the 1980s.
From about 1980 to 1986, slashers become the money shot film to
They
make.
were what superhero movies are today.
Exactly. And we will be discussing that in part 3. Slashers, an American genre.
Yes. So join us next time for the conclusion of our epic 3-part history of slashers. Do you want to say anything about the podcast?
I do actually. I want to give before I start plugging ourselves, shameless plug, I want to talk about a few people who helped us to get to where we are today. First off, thank you to everyone who has liked, subscribed, shared, promoted, and given us positive feedback on the podcast. We even appreciate constructive criticism if it helps us to be better. It's wonderful to have people correcting us on the internet because it helps us to do better and to do a better job as long as it's done constructively. We appreciate people who have shared this with their friends. I want to thank personal friends Anthony Vigil, who gave us all this sound equipment that we use to soundproof the area, as well as the microphones that we will use when we adapt to future recordings. I also want to thank the Honorable Reverend Dr. Jennifer James, MFA, DDS, Most Deaf, a.k.a. Black Truffle, as a sociological consultant. Yeah, for part 1, Harry's giving me a weird look. She knows what I mean. And everyone who liked, subscribed, shared, thanked the entire Carpenter family, the entire City Arts and Tech family who supported this. Please tell your friends about Cinematic Oblivion. Rate, review, subscribe, and share.
Yeah, and if you want to see further readings, show notes, details like that, you can check out cinematicoblivion.com, where Nick keeps a pretty tight ship of behind-the-scenes information.
If I find any free links to any of the films we've talked about on YouTube or other websites, I will link them so you can watch these films for free.
You can follow along with us. And if you have any questions or comments or concerns, you can email me at cinematicoblivion@gmail.com, and we will be reading your mail on the show if we get any good questions.
We really do appreciate the feedback. We really do appreciate the corrections, omissions, and all that. We will be back to cover 1979 through 1988 with Slashers Part 3, an American genre.
So anyway, thank you for tuning in, and we will see you next time on Cinematic Oblivion.